Good evening and welcome to the Monday, September 10th Issaquah City Council Committee Work Session. We have 4 items on the agenda tonight. It's a pretty full evening, so we will get rolling with Agenda Bill 7665, the 2019 legislative agenda. We're going to start with Jean Paul, our management analyst.
Good evening. My name is Jean Paul, and I'm a management analyst in the executive office. I'm joined this evening by my fellow analyst, Liesl Olson, and by the city's governmental affairs consultant, Shelley Helder. And we're here this evening to present the legislative agenda for 2019 to 2021. Here's the outline slide for what we intend to cover this evening. I'll provide a general overview of what we're here to accomplish, followed by some background information to help put the work we've done up until this point in context. Once I've done that, Shelley will provide a preview of the legislative session and a review of our agenda, and then Liesl will provide a summary of the policy manual. Finally, we'll answer any questions you have and collect any additional feedback.
Before you go further, can I clarify? So this is a draft?
Correct.
Right? And the intention is that we're going to hear about it tonight, we're going to mull it over, and then we're going to take action on it potentially on September 17th, yes?
Correct.
Okay.
And that's what I was hoping to accomplish on this slide.
Oh, I'm sorry, I buried the lead.
Yes.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
Carry on.
To help frame the work session a little more, the administration's ultimately asking for the council to adopt the legislative agenda, but while the actual adoption is slated for next week on the 17th, we're setting aside the time tonight to ensure you can answer the questions: are the priorities we are asking for identified correct and clear, and is the language we presented strong enough or too strong? And then in answering those questions, we're prepared to collect your feedback and allow staff members to edit the documents, but we're not asking to turn this into an exercise in wordsmithing. This timeline will help provide additional context to why we're here this evening. Gordon Thomas Honeywell was awarded the contract for lobbying services in May 2018, and based on their recommendations, we have made 3 major changes to our agenda development process. The first of those 3 changes was to create and approve the legislative agenda in time to potentially influence the governor's budget proposal, which is produced prior to the actual legislative session. And to meet that timeline, staff members have been working with our consultants since June to develop this agenda. We're here tonight to discuss what we have produced, and will return next week on the 17th for the council to approve it. Other important dates on the horizon include the legislative breakfast, which is tentatively scheduled for either December 11th or 13th, and the legislative session, which begins in January and will run through March of 2019. In terms of the documents themselves, this is where the recommendations of our consultants resulted in the other 2 significant changes. The first was to take what was historically one combined document and to separate it into 2. The legislative agenda priorities, which is a single-page document in your packet, contains the top 3 funding requests for the issues the city deems most critical to the ongoing operations and the community's long-term vision. The second document is the policy manual. This document presents the city's positions of interest for relevant issues in a support, oppose, or track and monitor format. Both of these documents account for the final recommendation and change, which is to take a biennial view which matches the legislature's 2-year session and budget cycle. And now Shelley will provide a preview of the legislative session and a review of the agenda priorities.
Thanks, Jean. You teed that up well. Again, Shelley Helder, your contract lobbyist at the state level. Thank you for making time this evening to hear the work that we've been doing for you all. So I want to start just very briefly by explaining a little bit of the political context as we consider the priorities. Let me just get situated a little bit. Okay, and I'll go through this very quickly since I think Jean really touched on it, but what I'd like to do is provide political context so that as we're talking about the legislative priorities, you're taking into account what the composition of the 2018 legislature will be. It's important to know what's expected so we know what are realistic requests of the legislature. In that vein, I'm sure many of you monitored the outcome of the August primary results, and based on those results, we're fairly confident that the House and the Senate will be majority Democrat in 2019. The November election will determine how big that majority is. Historically, it's been a very narrow majority, and that's influenced the different types of policies that have been able to be passed by the legislature. So again, in November, we'll know how great that majority is. In the House in particular, there's the potential for a supermajority by the Democrats. That's a 2/3 majority. It would allow House Democrats to essentially conduct business without any Republicans present. I doubt that that'll be the case, but it would be significant. The last time there was a supermajority in both the House and the Senate was in 2007, so it's been a while. Some of the other changes that we expect in the 2019 legislature is there were 15 legislators that decided not to run for re-election during this cycle. So that's not only a significant number of legislators, but also some of those that decided not to run were legislators that were in key leadership roles. In particular, Representative Judy Cliburn, who was the chair of the House Transportation Committee, the minority leader for the House Republican caucus, the majority leader for the Senate Democrats. So really big shoes to fill when it comes to legislators that'll be stepping up to take over leadership roles. And then also, once the November election takes place, depending on who is elected, there'll be a meeting, committee on committees, to determine which members sit on which committees and which committees are chaired, and then have correlating ranking members appointed to them. The composition of the committees is significant because it determines where the legislators from our delegation end up, focusing a lot of their time and energy, and then also it gives us awareness of who the legislators are that we'll be focusing on for particular policy areas. And then the last thing that I'll mention regarding the November election is that there will be 4 initiatives on the ballot. And the reason I mention that is because all 4 of these issues, whether or not they pass by the voters in November, we do anticipate that they will make up a significant amount of the conversation down in Olympia beginning in January. Some of the basics for the 2019 session, Jean touched on this a little bit, but the state operates on a 2-year budget process. 2019 is the beginning of that 2-year cycle. It's scheduled to last 105 days. I'm sure you're aware that in the past they have gone over that amount. At this point, I think your guess is as good as mine as to whether that'll be the case in 2019. But really the focus of this first year of the biennium is to adopt operating, capital, and transportation budgets. And to provide some background on the operating budget, since the state has met the McCleary mandate and fully funded K-12 education, the operating budget is expected to be the largest in state history. Despite that, there are significant strains on the operating budget, and so a lot of the conversation about the budget is around how to make sure that there's adequate funding for education, and there's pent-up demand for new programs since there hasn't been a lot of new funding available since prior to the recession. So operating budget money will be tight going into 2019. Capital budget, it is a function of the operating budget, and so with the largest operating budget in state history, we do anticipate a very robust capital budget. This is where we anticipate there to be the greatest opportunity, particularly for local governments. While the largest portion of the capital budget is allocated for K-12 construction, there is grant opportunities for local governments, and we'll get to that shortly. But the capital budget we do anticipate to be very opportunistic this coming year. And then lastly, the transportation budget. The 2015 Connecting Washington package adopted a series of, when they adopted it in 2015, they projected out the revenue for 16 years and allocated projects accordingly. For this 2019-21 biennium, there was always the anticipation that it would be very short or very tight in terms of revenue versus projects allocated. And so they expected that, and now they're confident that there's definitely going to be a shortfall, roughly $200 million for this biennium. There's potential that some of that shortfall will be made up with projects that are not on schedule, and so they'll voluntarily be pushed out to future biennia. But either way, the transportation budget is also going to be a tight budget. Kind of parallel to that, there is conversation about a potential mini package. Senator Hobbs, the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, has said many times that he's very interested in a mini package and is unsure whether there's the political appetite to talk about a package so soon after the last one has just passed. There's also concern that if the carbon tax initiative passes on the November ballot, that that'll eat up a lot of the gas tax ability to fund a transportation package. So a lot remains in the air. If there is that mini package, the thought is that some of the priority projects for that package would include projects that were not major projects that were not funded in Connecting Washington, one of them being the US 2 trestle in Snohomish County, another being the Columbia River Bridge down in Clark County. So that's a very high-level overview of the 3 state budgets. In addition to the budgets, the legislature is going to be considering thousands of policy bills. Hundreds of them will have impact on local governments, particularly cities. And we're already aware of some of the topics that will be discussed in 2019. And I won't go over all of them in detail, but I do want to call attention to mental health funding. This is one that a lot of folks are talking about right now, and for kind of 3 reasons. One, Western State Hospital has lost its federal certification, and with that, roughly $53 million in federal funding. So the state will need to make up for that loss in revenue. The governor earlier this year announced a desire to reform the state's mental health system over the next 5 years. That plan is still being developed, but anticipate that it's going to be a significant investment from operating and state dollars, somewhere in the range between $300 and $500 million over that 5 years. And then lastly, there is a Supreme Court case that's called True Blood, and really what this is getting at is the state's obligation to provide competency evaluation and restoration services within a certain time period. That lawsuit, the plaintiffs for that lawsuit have put together a settlement, and if the state agrees to that settlement, then the settlement requires additional state resources to meet that lawsuit. So that's a little bit about mental health and why it's going to be such a huge topic and a significant strain on the operating budget in 2019. I'll also mention affordable housing, because I know this is an item that we'll get to later, but is recommended as an item on the city's policy manual. House Bill 2437 is a bill that was introduced last session. It was prime-sponsored by Representative June Robinson from Snohomish County. And the basic concept is allowing a local option for cities or counties, part of that is up in the air right now, to use a credit against the state sales tax to construct affordable and supportive housing. In various versions of the bill, it would require a local match. That match is dependent on what the tax rate would be, so it's very complex, well, not very complex, but the policy is in development right now, and it's an issue that was discussed last session. There was support for it. There's stakeholder meetings happening right now in order to get this bill primed and ready for January so it can hopefully sail through the process, because on both sides of the aisle, there's understanding and agreement that something needs to be done to provide increased affordable and supportive housing. And then I'll also briefly mention the Condominium Liability Act. This is a proposal that's being brought forward by the Master Builders Association and the realtors, and really what this is condominiums within Washington State have not been constructed over the last several years, and one of the reasons for that, many believe, is there's increased liability for developers to build condominiums as opposed to apartments. So one of the proposals is to adjust that liability exposure by reforming the state's Condominium Act. The Association of Washington Cities has identified this item with the overarching theme of affordable housing as one of its potential priorities for 2019 as well. Here we are, AWC priorities. Yeah.
All right, question here, Councilmember Ramos.
Yes, back on that last slide, the last item you didn't touch on is small cell network facilities.
Yes.
Because they attempted preemption before, that backed off. We're working with them now, and I just saw in the news yesterday, the day before, they're attempting preemption again. So that is a big deal to us.
Yes.
Not really mentioned here because I think it's even newer. So somehow I want to make sure we get this in here because I don't think anybody in this city supports a preemptive act on how we control what gets built in our city or any other city. So I'm not sure how, but I'm seeing that heads nod that that's something we need to make sure we're up with on that, I think.
Yes, City Administrator Moon.
Thank you. Just a quick update on that. We have a conference call on Friday with city attorney staff to discuss the potential and to have a discussion about municipalities sort of bounding together and perhaps writing a letter to the FCC to state our claim. The effective prohibitions in that ruling would basically upend our current ordinance. So it's extremely significant.
Yeah, and so however we need to make sure that's added in here, that's, like I say, the details may be coming yet. But I guess the story for me is they tried it once, it didn't work, they're trying it again. I would expect that they're going to try this again and again and again until they try to get it passed. So I just want to make sure we have that on our radar for the long term.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that feedback. And I'll just add that the Association of Washington Cities is also planning on putting together a letter to the FCC as well. So the Association of Washington Cities is in the process of developing its legislative agenda for the 2019 session, and on the screen is their 5 recommended priorities. Their Legislative Priorities Committee has met over the summer, identified these as the association's top priorities, and the board will be meeting later this month to approve these priorities. So the reason I share this is for your awareness, so you know what the association is doing on your behalf, but also because some of these items are mentioned in the policy manual. And so just want to see how, or want you to be aware how our advocacy is in alliance or in support and in coordination with the association.
I have a question for you about that.
Yeah.
On the funding of basic law enforcement academy classes, what was it this year? And what does this expected? Does this go far enough to clear out the backlog?
Great question. So in the current operating budget, 10 classes are funded. The request is for 19 classes, so that's an additional 9 classes. And that number came from the CJTC based on their estimates of the current backlog. And so the thought is that 19 classes would address the backlog. It's been crafted in a way that would allow them to make adjustments if the backlog continues to grow and 19 is not sufficient. But right now, they expect that 19 classes per year would meet the need.
Thank you. Councilmember Ramos.
Yeah, just a good comment on the infrastructure part on the Public Works Assistance Board to continue to push strongly on that. That is also very critical. Cities and WC obviously is pushing on that. I'm actually on the Public Works Board, so clarify that so it's not misunderstood. But yeah, that is important to all our cities to continue our good, solid infrastructure. So thanks for having that on there.
Yeah. Okay. And Jean spoke to this a little bit already, but the reason that we're before you all today in September when session doesn't start until January is because we want to be able to hit the ground running when session starts in January. And part of that is to develop the city's priorities now, be in conversations with the governor's policy staff and budget writers as they're beginning to work on their budget proposals. The governor's budget is released in December, and the governor's budget proposal really is the basis for the legislature when they begin developing their operating capital and transportation budgets during session. And then, of course, January session begins, and that's when we want to be ready to advocate on your behalf. And prior to session, we want to make sure that we've met with each member of the city's legislative delegation so that they're briefed on what the priorities are and aware of the issues that are of concerns to the city that, could have negative impacts. Oh, and the last thing I'll mention on that slide is visits to Olympia. The legislative agenda, which we'll go over shortly, is the vision for that document is that would be the item that you all use with you when you hopefully come down to Olympia for Association of Washington Cities Action Days, or any other time when you want to come down and meet with your legislators to discuss the city's priorities. The legislative agenda is the document that is intended to be the leave behind that outlines the city's top requests. So these are some of the items that we discussed with staff as we were putting together the recommended or draft legislative agenda. As already been mentioned, we recommend that it be a biennial agenda, and that's to match up with the state's biennial budget process. Recommend that we focus on 2 to 3 priorities. Oftentimes, cities choose more than that, and their legislative delegation is supportive of more requests, but ultimately, legislators have limited bandwidth. And so really identifying what those priorities are for your legislators so they know the top items that they should be spending their time and their political capital on is very helpful for them. Obviously, we want to make sure that there's correlation to the city's short-term and long-term goals, that we're building on previous successes, and that if we are making budget requests, which the recommended agenda has, that we focus on one request per budget. So these are the items that are recommended as the top requests for the 2019-21 legislative agenda. The first is funding for pilot cleanup for PFAS. The city, Eastside Fire and Rescue, and Department of Ecology are currently doing a study. Some of those results are expected to be available later this year. So we don't have a specific dollar amount yet. Based on the study results, we hope to more narrowly define that amount and then specifically what the pilot cleanup would entail. But really at this time, we know that this is a priority issue for the community, and our message to our legislators is this problem's not going away, and we want to make sure that we can identify the source and clean up the source sooner rather than later. This is a request from the state's operating budget. The implementation of the I-90 Front Street is transportation, and the last one is capital. So I just point that out to you because there's a request from each of the state budgets, which is the recommendation that we made. The second is implementation of the I-90.
Well, go ahead, I'm going to ask about this.
Sure. Of the I-90 Front Street Interchange Justification Report. This is work that the city has been doing this in coordination with WashDOT, and the IJR has identified improvements. The next step to the process is to begin implementation of that IJR. And so this is a request for $4 million from the state's transportation budget to begin implementation in 2019-21.
Did you have a question, Councilor
Yes, I do. Maybe you just know how to tee things up with the right timing. In July, a staff report indicated about the IJR that the alternatives have been selected for analysis, but it's actually going to be not complete until next June. Now, the language in front of us today is like that's a done deal, that these options have been selected. Let's get going on design. So it doesn't seem to be completely in sync. However, I do recognize that this is a 2019-2020 budget cycle, and that just got my attention. It's like, do I think that an overcrossing is going to be part of it? Probably. But it hasn't been formally been determined by that study yet. So can you speak to the timing of our request when something isn't complete?
Yes, yeah, and I mean, that's a great point. The timing of requests is challenging. Unfortunately, the legislature doesn't match up with the timing of all of our studies, and I think both the PFAS request and the IJR request kind of get to that challenge. But ultimately, we believe that when the IJR process is complete, we know that the next step is going to be pre-design and environmental documentation. And so essentially we believe that the alternative that we are planning on doing will be selected. And so we're planning ahead, I guess you could say, to make sure that we have funding allocated. Because if we wait until July, the biennial budget will already be adopted.
So two follow-ons real quick. So the ask isn't about any specific element of what might be proposed. It's just banking some design and environmental review money in anticipation that there will be some recommendation. And so we wouldn't be tying this request to any particular outcome at this stage? Because there may be multiple outcomes that they recommend that we're all interested in.
Correct.
That's all I need to know. Thank you.
Administrator Moon?
Thank you. I'll just add that you've both characterized that correctly. We are planning to do an update for council later in October, so we hope to have a little bit more information. We are assuming that some of the alternatives, if not all of the options, will have some advantages for us over status quo. And so this request is really more about pushing forward this project as a priority of the state. Right now, only the first phase has been funded, and that's that data collection and development of alternatives, but we want them to move forward with the next steps of this project, doing the pre-design and moving toward construction. So that's really what this ask is about, is continue putting money into this project. Let's see some improvements here.
Thank you. Proceed.
Thanks. And then the last item is a request from the capital budget for the transit-oriented development and the Opportunity Center. And this is a $3 million request. And I'll just say that this $3 million request from the capital budget is an ambitious request. Typically, the appropriations for projects like this are between $1 to $2 million. And the reason that we've recommended this $3 million amount, one, we do anticipate the capital budget to be very robust this year, as I mentioned previously. Two, the nature of this project is very unique, and given the conversations happening in the legislature, we really think that this project is ripe for the legislature to jump on and want to invest in. And then lastly, there's some project partners that when making a request, if you come to the legislature with multiple partners who are all speaking with one voice, oftentimes that project can receive a higher level of funding than if you were the only entity making the request. So again, $3 million is ambitious, but we think it is within the scope of possibility, given all the reasons that I just outlined. So with that, those are the recommended top priorities for the 1921 budget, and I'll turn it over to Liesl to go over the policy manual, which speaks to some of the other areas that the city may support but aren't top priorities. Happy to answer questions.
Councilmember Hunt.
Thank you. Question on the PFAS pilot cleanup. I wondered, first of all, it says TBD for the ask, and so I wondered if you could give us a sense of if the ask is going to be comparable to the other two items, or an approximation of how much the ask will be. And then also about the pilot cleanup. I recognize that there was a study that was done and about PFAS, and then this is, as you said, to keep the legislature aware that this is an ongoing need and that there's still more need for funding. So I wondered about this pilot cleanup, and if we expect that this will be one of several steps, and that this will be an ongoing discussion about PFAS.
Yeah. You sure?
Great, I'd be happy to answer that. It is TBD because we have not yet determined what the scope and therefore the cost of the next phase would be. The first phase is about characterization and sampling, data collection, And we hope to have majority of the data collected by the end of this month. Then we will sit down together, all the partners, and kind of talk about what we think it means. And through those discussions, then we will hopefully come to some consensus about what the next phase of work should be, whether that includes collecting some additional information or actually moving on to some sort of mitigation remediation project. So we don't know at this time. As Shelley mentioned, this is just to raise awareness, first with the governor's budget and then hopefully with the legislature's budget, so that we can have a placeholder and come back to and say, this is of importance statewide. It's something Department of Commerce and Ecology and Department of Health have been involved with, and hopefully we can just build kind of a coalition of support so that when we're ready to define the scope and cost of that next phase, we'll be able to put a number in. Now, we certainly will brief council after phase 1 is done so that you know what resulted from that, and speak with you about choices we have about how to commence on phase 2. So there'll still be an opportunity to get your input on that.
Councilmember Ray?
Can you spend just a couple minutes and talk about the process you went through to define our legislative priorities that are up there?
Sure. We followed same sort of practice that we've had in the past, where we sample department directors in particular. They have conversations with their staff. We talk about potential projects, potential requests. Then we test those with our lobbyists to ask, do you think we could shape up something that could be successful? Certainly consult with the mayor, and the mayor made these selections in consultation with staff and the lobbyist. These have been priorities of the council in the past, and so we have that level of input as well. And each of these projects had new needs or needs in funding that need to be addressed. So hopefully that answers your question.
Councilmember Goodman?
Thank you. Can somebody talk a little bit more about the $3 million for the TOD and the Opportunity Center and how that number was landed on? And I don't recall this being any priority in the past. And then speak to a little bit about how it says developing a successful legislative, well, go ahead and answer those first.
Okay, sure. So when council last took action on TOD and the Opportunity Center, you're aware that we had a funding gap that we needed to close, and our commitment to you at that time was to go and seek additional funding resources for that component of the project. So that's what I mean as it having been discussed and a priority of the city. Where the number came from, that gap had yet to be completely defined, but I think we phrased it for the particular option that council voted on was estimated to have to be a maximum of $5 million. And so in consultation with our lobbyists, the advice was go and seek $3 million, that this would be a project that legislators would be apt to support, and that we should try to aim high. We may not get all of this, but that was the advice that we were given, and so we landed at $3 million, which we think is in the ballpark of having a reasonable chance of success, but may also be a stretch.
So to be clear, it's not the whole transit-oriented development, it's just the Opportunity Center.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions right now? Deputy Council President Batiste.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, when you talked a little bit about the mini package for transportation, it sounds like that's just being tossed around, but I was wondering if there were any potential projects that would impact us locally or regionally that might be on the plate if something were to come forward with a mini package?
Yes, great question. So one of the other projects that would impact this region is conversations about the I-90 State Route 18 interchange. So that's something that's come up as potentially being included in that mini package. The conversation about the mini package, right now they want to focus on just a few of the major projects that would impact key congestion areas within the state. Anytime you talk about a transportation package, if it's going to be funded through gas tax revenues and all Washington state citizens are going to be paying that tax, it opens up the conversation to, well, where's the benefit to citizens throughout the state? So while those are the few key projects that are being discussed right now, if that becomes politically viable, I would anticipate that more projects would be added to that list.
I'll ask, I thought exit 25, the actual interchange, was already funded for redoing it. I thought the question was really 18 south of exit 25.
You know, that's a great question. In my research, the interchange has been funded, so I'm not sure, and the people that have been talking about the interchange and with 90 and 18, if they're talking about potential down the road changes, or if they're confusing that with the expansion of 18 further south. It could be that the folks that are talking about the interchange aren't aware that it's already funded.
Well, you know, if they want to put extra money into that area, they could go to 4 lanes on 18.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
that would be great. Other questions? No. All right.
Great. Lisa?
Thank you, Shelley. Like Jean mentioned, my name is Lisa Olson, and I'm one of the other management analysts in the executive office. So I just want to touch briefly on the draft policy manual that you have in your package. This represents an opportunity for the city to support, oppose, and track and monitor positions of interest to Issaquah. Like Jean mentioned, we've split these into 2 distinct documents so you can really maintain that focused nature of the legislative agenda priorities. These draft positions represent input from a variety of sources, including city staff, professional associations, regional partners, stakeholders, and the lobbyists. This manual represents 10 broad policy areas and probably looks similar to manuals that the City Council has approved in the past. The positions on the policy manual are largely consistent with positions from previous years' legislative agendas. You'll notice that we've moved transportation and transit to the top of the policy manual because obviously this is a top priority for the city. There's also been a new topic added to the manual around affordable housing and health and human services. Previous policy manuals have touched on these issues in a variety of ways, but we thought including that into one separate topic was important because, again, these are important topics to the city at hand. So with that, I'll open it up for more questions and comments.
Other questions? Councilmember Winterstein?
Just a comment. Anyway, hello and welcome. I don't believe we've had a chance to meet.
Thank
so
you.
Pleased to meet you. A general comment, I do really like the organization. I think the focus of the 3 priorities and as it's presented as being in those different funding categories as those top priorities is a good structural move, and the overall kind of structure and presentation of the handbook as the leave behind, I guess we were calling that, even with a careful use of bolding on the action that's actually being called. I think just from that consumability and understandability where we're standing, and that part of it I like. No comment yet on content, but I do like that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hunt?
I have 2 comments. I noticed in the earlier presentation that affordable housing and the condominium liability was under affordable housing. I think in my mind that makes sense. It would diversify our housing stock, and that's a real need that Issaquah is facing. And so in the policy manual, I noticed that it's under land use, and to me it makes sense to at least, if it could be in both places or maybe in affordable housing. And then The other comment I had is that we've recently been talking about some of the challenges around recycling, and I saw that there's a support to expand product stewardship. I think that that sounds like a very reasonable way to address some of the issues on the supply side. And so my thought there would be that maybe also that could be some of the emerging challenges around recycling could be factored into that discussion. That's it. Thanks.
Councilmember Ray?
So just a comment, when I look at the slide that Shelley presented that says developing a successful legislative agenda, and I look particularly at the fifth bullet that says full support of the council and the community, and I hearken back to the process we went through to develop the current legislative agenda, which didn't involve reaching out to the community, and this is the first, I think, in this particular set of priorities that we've seen of it. I'm wondering if there is a way for us to vet some of these top three priorities in the agenda with the community before we have a chance to come back and make a go, no-go decision on this next week.
Administrator Moon?
Sure. As you suggested, timeline's a little tight in order to achieve our goal of getting this in front of the governor's budget staff, but we can certainly post it and do a little news item, call some attention to it.
Other questions or comments? I actually have one around looking at the policy manual. I don't see anything there about state marijuana revenues. Is that a solved problem? Are we now getting our fair share? I didn't hear that at any point that's gotten better. So is that something, I would think that would be something that all cities everywhere in the state feel strongly about.
Yeah, and that was an oversight on our part. So that is an ongoing conversation and something that we can definitely incorporate into the policy manual.
Yes, there's a stunning amount of money in recreational marijuana, and more of it should go to local public safety.
Yep.
Other questions? You have other materials that you're going to present? All right.
No, that's
so then at this point, we're not obviously making any decisions here tonight, but I would open it up if any members of the public want to take 3 minutes and give us their thoughts on on this item in particular. I'm also going to, later, I'm going to ask for public input on the water system plan and public input on the facility space study. But if anybody wishes to speak to this one this evening, they're welcome to come to the podium. Oh, sir? Would you like to? Please come to the podium, and if you wish, state your name in relationship to the city or not.
Yeah. Good evening. My name's Steve. I've been a resident of Issaquah since 1989. One of my comments is on the condo issue. That is not a viable concept, in my opinion. The reason people do not want to buy condos is the homeowners association dues that constantly go up every year. That's why they avoid condos. They prefer maybe an apartment. You don't have to pay those, that sort of thing. Some of my other issues are on the proposed initiative to tax groceries. I find that preposterous. I feel that hurts low-income people. So, but I'm assuming SNAP members will be exempt. And the other initiatives, the carbon tax, I think is polling very poorly. That will not pass. And the gun control issue, now I'm on the fence on that one, but I have an issue with the gun range over there by the high school. I think the council should consider more restrictions on hours of which they shoot the guns, because Saturday they shouldn't be able to allow till afternoon because people would like to sleep in on Saturday mornings, perhaps. No shooting on guns on Sunday, in my opinion, and just reduced hours. I know they contributed the land for the high school and all that, but I think there should be some more about the hours, because especially people on this side of Issaquah they can hear that, the shots all the time. So that's about all I have to say. Thank you for taking my input.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I don't normally do feedback with the audience, but I will point out that the gun range is in unincorporated King County, not within the city of Issaquah, and so we have very limited authority and responsibility with the gun range. It's just outside the city boundaries of Issaquah. But thank you for your comments very much. I appreciate it. So with that, we will move on to Agenda Bill 7538, Updated Water System Plan. This is the third of three conversations we've had. As we bring in our team of experts, it's going to be led up by Bob York, Utilities Engineering Manager, and Jeff Hansen, our consultant. There's always a first. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hello. Good evening. How are you?
Three of three.
That's right. Part
This is the Return of the King, if it was the Lord of the Rings movies.
Keep the tempo.
Right. Hopefully shorter than the Return of the King.
We'll try.
That one was 3+ hours.
Here's the, here it is. Did you find it?
I think we got it. All right, I'll let you.
Okay. Good evening, council members. Tonight's the third of three planned work sessions. Oh, I'm Bob York, Public Works Engineering Utilities Manager, by the way. Tonight's the third of three planned work sessions, during which the various macro topics of the water system plan have or will be discussed. In June, the primary topic was, as you recall, water conservation. That was the focus. And in July, we focused on water supply options. So tonight's session will focus on water quality considerations, but of necessity, tonight's session also will integrate the prior discussions into what we feel are cohesive alternatives for you to think about. As noted on the agenda, we have a little more time allotted for this session because of the additional complexities. And we anticipate there'll be robust discussions on this issue. Our goal tonight is for you to provide direction to us on your remaining information needs, your priorities, and next steps. Ultimately, our goal is to ask the council to adopt a final water system plan that would incorporate all these considerations, hopefully by the end of the year.
And can I ask, we sort of like to talk about you are here, like when you're at the mall and it shows you where you are in the mall.
Okay.
So are we looking to have this come back to infrastructure before it comes back to full council, or just back to full council, I see sometime before November 19th?
Here's a timeline we have on our presentation.
Was the presentation in the packet? Why did I not, how could I not find it?
Well, the water system plan's huge. The presentation's not that huge.
Council President Martz, perhaps we can launch into this, and if we don't answer the question by the time we get to this slide, we can
Thank you.
come back. Thanks.
Did you want to talk about this now, or?
That's fine, that's fine.
Okay, well, I'm just going to introduce Jeff Hansen once again. Jeff's our consultant from HDR, who's been doing the prior presentations and planning on doing this one. And also, we have Pierre Kwan for this in the audience. He's from HDR also. Pierre was the mastermind of the PFAS Well 4 project a couple of years ago, and a treatment expert in the water, in the world of potable water. So Pierre's here just in case, and you see Brett back here too tonight in case there's operational topics that come up. So with that, I'm going to yield the floor to Jeff Hansen.
All right, thanks, Bob. So we'll get this teed up. So yes, we'll get to that timeline and where we're heading from here as we go. We'll get to that point. All right, so first, quickly, an outline of the discussion tonight. First, we'll recap the 3 policy issues that we've been bringing in front of you. Again, those deal with conservation, water supply, and then water quality and treatment. So we'll go over that again. Do a quick recap of where we've been, since it's been a couple months since last we talked. So recap of the identified future water supply deficiency in the areas of the system that are currently served by city groundwater. Talk about the options that are available to the city to resolve that deficiency. Again, we've talked about that before, but we're going to hit that again. Then tonight we're going to talk about treatment requirements and options. And then, as Bob mentioned, we're going to talk about the combination of water supply and treatment, and then present to you a cost and risk analysis. That's a new piece that you have not seen before. We'll talk about that. And then at the end of that, we'll talk about what is the recommended, what we call integrated solution that we're bringing forward to council that incorporates all 3 of those elements: conservation, supply, and treatment. And then we'll talk about where you are in the process and propose next steps. So what we're looking for from you tonight is to, as always, listen, ask questions, and by the end of tonight, we're looking, as Bob said, for input from you on what additional information do you need to take action on the proposed water system plan. And we're going to distinguish that action from other future things, other future steps that will come subsequent to the water system plan. So that will become clear as we go. And then we'd like you to suggest how you want to proceed with further deliberation. And again, the initial plan was to get action on the water system plan, adoption of the plan, by the end of the year. But there is flexibility in that. That's not a hard and fast requirement. So the policy issues in the water system plan. The question can really be thought of this way, as posed on the screen, and that is, should the city approve the administration's recommendations on the following policy issues to be incorporated into the final water system plan? Again, those 3 categories. First, conservation. The proposed or the recommended movement forward is to use Cascade Water Alliance regional water conservation goals and informal targets to track trends. On water supply, the recommendation is to transition Talus back to regional supply and then implement a blended groundwater regional supply for the remaining areas that are currently only served by groundwater. And finally, with respect to water quality and treatment, the recommendation is to develop a new centralized treatment facility to optimize treatment, meet requirements of evolving regulations, and support the blending of supplies. Some of this we've talked about before, other parts are new. Like I said, I'm just going to do a real quick look backward before we look forward. So, the need or the primary issue that is in front of the city is the comparison of water demand, the forecasted water demand in the area of the city that's currently on groundwater, against the limiting capacity of that groundwater supply. This is a chart that you all have seen before. The bars that increase over time represent water demand on a maximum day basis in the area of the city fed by groundwater supply. The red horizontal line at 4 million gallons per day is the capacity of the city's groundwater wells. And what we see is that the demand will is projected to exceed that capacity over time. We've talked about how conservation can help. We've talked about how the shifting of Talus back to regional supply can help this situation. And that's depicted in the graph. I'm not going to go through those details, but the bottom line is written in red there, and that is that the demand forecast indicates that by sometime between 2021 and 2027, additional regional supply will be needed in areas that currently receive only groundwater supply. So that's the problem. That's the issue in front of you. What are the options to resolve that deficiency? Again, we've talked about these before. I'm going to hit these pretty quickly. Option 1 is to introduce regional supply into this area and blend it with the groundwater supply. Okay? That would result in an introduction of regional supply into areas of the city that have not previously utilized it, requires a modified treatment of your existing groundwater to blend those supplies safely and reliably, and it allows you to retain your local sources, your wells, to support source reliability. Option 2, on the other end of the spectrum, is to go to an all-regional supply. So that would be introducing Cascade supply 100% into the area that's currently served by the groundwater wells. There are a couple sub-options there, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the money part of the discussion. One option is to pay the RCFCs, the Regional Capital Facilities Charges, to Cascade for that additional capacity. Or there is an option for you to transfer your wells and your water rights to Cascade. At the end of the day, this option results in a loss of control over your local sources. Last time we talked about a third option, and you wanted us to explore this in a little bit more detail, and that was to reduce the area or the footprint of the city that is served only by groundwater and shift only a portion of the area over to regional supply. So this would involve a modification of the distribution system to make a smaller area that would be served only by groundwater and extend the length of time that that area would be served by groundwater before regional supply would come in. This would also result in different water qualities in this valley area that's currently served by groundwater. And furthermore, we'll talk more about this in a moment, it requires extensive piping and valving to make this solution happen. So let's talk a little bit more about that option 3, because we have not discussed it in detail previously. So, of course, the question is, what area of the city could conceivably be converted to regional supply that's currently on groundwater? You've seen this map before. The area in green is the area of the city that is currently receiving groundwater and only groundwater. No regional supply is going to the green area. The areas in blue, and then over here in the highlands, these areas are currently receiving regional supply. So we took an engineering look at what could happen in the green area to convert a portion of that to regional. It's challenging because that entire area, that distribution system, was developed over time to work together to move groundwater around. There is an area, however, in the northwest, there's an approximate footprint shown there, that could potentially be converted to regional supply, okay, by valving off of pipes and whatnot. The benefits, if the city were to do that, by moving regional supply into that area only, it would defer the need to blend in regional supply for the rest of the green area approximately 3 to 6 years. It depends on growth and how quickly demands would grow in that area. But that would be the benefit of taking that approach. Well, what are the costs of that? Well, it requires extensive repiping and valving to maintain certain levels of service. If you were to do that, you would be, and if you didn't do any additional piping, you would now only have one single feed to one of your key reservoirs. So to maintain the level of reliability and redundancy that you have in the system right now, you would have to have additional piping to maintain that redundancy. The other thing we looked at, without additional piping, if we carve out that area, we significantly reduce the fire flow availability to that area. So to resolve that and maintain your fire flow availability as it is now, additional work would be needed. So I'll get into the monetary part of that in a moment. But this was just in response to questions last time about, is it technically feasible to carve out a portion of the valley zone and transition that to regional? The answer is yes, but it comes with challenges and costs. Before I move on, any questions on that at this time?
Councilmember Hunt.
I'm wondering about the need for blending is extended by 3 to 6 years for this, what seems like a relatively small portion. Can you expand a little bit on how there's such an impact on the need for blending to be extended as much as 6 years out based on this one?
On the size of that area? So we took a look at that. That is a portion of where growth is anticipated to occur within the central Issaquah plan area. And so that estimate of 3 to 6 years is predicated, and this is rough, on a range of 25 to 50% of the new additional growth envisioned in the central Issaquah plan occurring in that area. So 25 to 50% of that new growth being accommodated there. Do we know if it's all going to go there? We don't. That's why we looked at a range. It seemed reasonable given the geographic the geographic area and how much of the central Issaquah plan it encompassed. So that's the basis for that. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So before I dive into the cost risk analysis, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about groundwater treatment and water quality considerations. So of the options we just talked about, options 1 and 3 both involve continued use of your wells, and so therefore require treatment of that groundwater supply to maintain compliance with water quality regulations. It's also important to note, as mentioned in the second bullet, that all of the options involve, at some point in time, introduction of regional supply into areas of the city that are currently not seeing regional water, that are currently only fed by groundwater. And therefore, water quality differences between your groundwater supplies and the regional supplies need to be considered when you're going to mix and blend those waters. And finally, just kind of a background statement, as regulations evolve at the federal and then state level, the city must plan for the ability to modify and optimize treatment. So when we talk about treatment, what are we referring to? I'm not going to go through this entire slide in great detail, or we really would be part 3 of 3 of the Lord of the Rings. I'm putting this up here to simply illustrate the range of types of parameters that the city currently addresses in treatment and will need to continue addressing. So I'm not going to go through all this information, but I'm going to go down that list of the parameters. So the things that the city, that you currently address at your groundwater wells: bacteria, that means disinfection, pH, arsenic, manganese, iron, PFAS, it's the PFOS, PFOA consideration. All of those things, if you look under current status, you are addressing either at all of your wells or at a minimum at the Gilman wells. And we simply provide some notes on potential future needs. If anything, things will become more complex with respect to some of those parameters. The item on the very bottom of the list here is fluoride. And we're acknowledging, obviously, you do not fluoridate the groundwater supply currently. By contrast, the regional supply is. So this begs the question of, well, what would happen in the future if you were to blend those supplies? And we are not prepared tonight to talk at great length about fluoridation, but that's because that's not paramount to the decision that is in front of you with respect to water supply options. As I mentioned earlier, regardless of the option that is chosen, regional supply will need to make its way into the area currently fed by groundwater. However, I want to make it very clear that that does not presuppose that all said areas will have to receive fluoride. And that is because as you march down the pathway of exploring treatment and planning and pre-designing treatment facilities, the city will have options in front of you. And we'll talk about that a little bit. You can fluoridate, you cannot fluoridate, which would result in a lower concentration of fluoride once those two supplies are blended, or you can remove fluoride. All these options are in front of you. But our point tonight is that that decision, we're not seeking direction or decision on that very important policy point this evening. The idea here is that that would come later in the process. Before I go on that, questions? Yes?
Regarding pH, actually, it's really about lead.
Yeah.
Is that how we manage lead?
Yes. So you'll see just to the right of pH, corrosion control. That's referring to lead and copper. And so, yes, at lower pH, leaching of lead, copper, more susceptible. So when we talk about corrosion control, we're talking about raising the pH of the groundwater supply.
Councilmember Hunt.
On fluoride, it says none. My understanding was that Talus, which is on groundwater, the current status is that that does have fluoride. Is that correct?
Is fluoride being introduced at Talus right now? It is. Okay. That is correct.
So current status would be Talus has.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Goodman.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that this is the groundwater treatment requirements. Talus is a different source.
So Talus is currently receiving groundwater supply.
It's treated.
For a while, for how long was it that it was receiving regional supply? It's gone back and forth historically. But as of approximately a year ago, when was that conversion made? March of this year. It had been on regional supply. Yeah. But it is seeing groundwater currently.
Interesting. Councilmember Ramos.
So the current groundwater going to Talus gets fluoridated at what point? At Talus, there's a fluoridation point there.
There's actually 3. Talus fluoridation has been installed, fluoride feed and monitoring equipment's been installed in Talus. When groundwater is used there, and we use groundwater there because it costs a lot less money to use groundwater than regional water, it is fluoridated. There's also capabilities to add fluoride if we were to push groundwater up to the highlands, but in that case, we're using 100% regional water. So those systems are there, but not currently active.
Councilmember Goodman.
So just curious, why would we introduce fluoride to Talus when they're on groundwater?
I think it was I wasn't here at the time, but when the Talus neighborhood and urban village was planned, the citizens were told that we would be fluoridating even if it was groundwater. So it wasn't no one lived there, so at first, is that correct? Come on up. He was here at the time. So he can tell you the real story now.
Brett Heath, Public Works Operations. So Talus has been on and off regional water a number of times. So I believe, if I remember correctly, it started off on regional water, fluoridated, switched over to groundwater, wanted to keep the fluoride going so we weren't putting people on fluoride, taking them off fluoride, et cetera. So the system up there does have the capability of fluoridating groundwater when it comes through. So when we went off of regional and onto groundwater, we maintained the fluoride in the system with the equipment in the Talus pump stations. Then it was switched back to regional water around the time of the slide, and then most recently switched back to groundwater, as Bob mentioned, for cost savings issue. But again, we were trying to maintain the fluoride delivery to our customers so it's constant. So they're not getting fluoride one year and not fluoride the next year. So does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Well, you answered my question. Yeah, we don't need to take any more time up with it. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so again, the list of parameters that the city is addressing and will need to continue addressing with respect to treatment of groundwater supplies. When we look at how you accomplish meeting those regulatory requirements, and we look to the future for potential changes, there's 2 main categories for the city of how to approach well supply treatment. So you currently have 2 well fields, Gilman and Risden, and you have treatment at both locations. And we would refer to that as segregated treatment. So one option is for the city to continue that way, continue with treatment provided at both wellheads as it is now. The alternative is a centralized treatment facility, so raw groundwater being pumped out of the wellheads and being conveyed to a central location where treatment would occur. When we look at those two options and what makes the most sense moving forward, we look at your existing wellhead locations, and we note that they're very space constrained. There's insufficient room for any sort of treatment expansion or upgrade, if necessary, in the future. We look at supply options 1 and 3, which would require blending of regional with groundwater supply. So that's important to take note of. And then one centralized treatment facility, as you might imagine, is easier and less expensive to operate and maintain as opposed to segregated or decentralized facilities. For all of these reasons, the water system plan recommends that as you look to the future of your treatment capabilities, that you look forward to a centralized treatment and blending facility. Is there a question?
Winterstein?
If we're going to talk more about it, just tell me, but would interpret from what you just said that whether the groundwater, local groundwater, and regional water, the vision would be that it comes to a central location for treatment before distribution to any of our customers.
Before distribution to any of the customers that are currently only seeing groundwater supply, meaning some of your customers.
So a water treatment facility in the scope that we're discussing there is not about the parts of the city currently receiving regional water.
Not necessarily, because there is possibility for water that is treated in the valley zone to make its way up into areas that are receiving regional supply, for example, the highlands, from in a separate way. Yeah.
So maybe we'll get more into that, but as you explain these options being available,
yeah,
it sounds like a lot of adaptability, which requires a lot of infrastructure to make happen. And it would seem to me that we should be discussing any type of investment for the future that gives us the most return to meet the need that we truly have, rather than building a lot of adaptability into the system.
So the system that is envisioned and the costs associated with it, which I'm going to get to in a moment, are associated with a central facility that will make water available to the area that's currently only seeing groundwater supply. So the infrastructure needed to potentially move that water to other areas, as I just mentioned, for example, the highlands, that infrastructure already exists. So the costs are those needed to, I'll say it this way, to address the problem or the challenge that we put forth. Okay? All right. So that being said, we conducted a cost risk analysis of the supply options that we've laid out. And a part of this is a 20-year present value or present worth cost analysis, where we're looking at upfront capital costs and then ongoing, annual O&M related costs. So again, the options you can see here: blended groundwater and regional supply. Option 2 is all regional, with 2 variants of that. The first one is the city retaining your groundwater wells. And the second is to transfer the wells and the water rights to Cascade Water Alliance. And then option 3 is that concept of a reduced groundwater only area. So in terms of costs, 20-year present worth, option 1, the blended approach, over 20 years, it's approximately a $43 million present worth cost. So again, what's incorporated in that? Some notes are down below. That includes capital costs for this centralized treatment and blending facility of approximately $24 million. And then over the course of 20 years, operation of that facility. And remember, under option 1, you're bringing in regional water supply, so you're paying those cascade costs for that supply. Okay, so $43 million. Option 2, if you retain your wells and you retain your water rights, to do that, you would have to pay to Cascade the RCFCs, a capital component that would be associated with the capacity that you would now be seeking from Cascade. So that cost, based on an analysis that staff did with Cascade about 2 years ago, is approximately $16 million. So that 94.8 that you see incorporates that RCFC cost, plus then every year as you use regional supply, there's the demand share, there's the demand cost for that water. So that incorporates those costs. Now the option 2B is where you transfer your wells and your water rights to Cascade. The assumption here is that if you were to do that, it's possible that Cascade might waive the RCFCs. Now we don't know that for sure, but it's a possibility. This is kind of the other end of the spectrum for the all-regional option. And then option number 3, you'll see we're showing the same present worth, 20-year present worth value that we're showing in option 1. And the reason for that is, again, through option 3, you have this potential to defer the need for bringing regional supply in. You would see some cost savings on that by deferring the time for when you would need to build the treatment facility. Those savings are offset by the cost of infrastructure needed to support that option, though, as I mentioned earlier, to maintain levels of service with respect to fire flow availability, redundancy, et cetera. Let me stop there and see if there are questions.
Are you going to break these down further? Or is,
This is what I have in the presentation for now, yeah.
I thought I heard in your description certain costs that were definitely one-time capital, but also others that were just for product, which I assumed that through billing of our customers, we would have offsetting revenue for. So these may be total costs, but some of them have offsetting revenues. So do you have the net capital?
I do not have, so the next step would be to translate this into, I think where you're heading, like rate impacts potentially.
Well,
and then
but just to
net
see,
capital.
well, these are numbers and by themselves, but again, I believe some, correct me if I'm wrong, some of them are offset by revenue. Others are not. They're a one-time capital outlay.
True, which would most likely in part be funded by debt service, right? Which would then.
Right, so the only revenue I'm talking about is we get from people paying bills. I
Right.
realize there's other ways for us to cover our costs, our capital costs included, but I'm just interested in the one-time capital as opposed to other costs that would have ongoing revenue associated with them.
So I think, to get at that, I don't have any other breakdown of the numbers. However, in essence, those capital components are shown down here in these notes. So for options 1 and 3, that capital cost is the $24 million. That's the treatment facility outlay. By comparison, option 2A, where you would retain your wells and you would pay Cascade the RCFCs, that's essentially a capital cost that you pay to Cascade. That's the $16.4 million that you see in that note down there. If that, I think that answers that question.
Councilmember Ray?
So I'm kind of wrestling with why 1 is so much cheaper than 2, and I have a suspicion, so I'm just going to throw it out there for you to respond to. So if we do the blending, we're operating the treatment facilities. If we go to all regional, Cascade Water Alliance is operating the treatment facilities.
If you go to all regional, there are no costs related to the wells to you.
Right. So does option number 1 reflect the operating cost over that 20-year period?
Yes.
It does.
It
So
does.
it's not just the capital investment, it's the capital and discounted and then the discounted operating cost.
Correct. That is correct. What the stark difference represents is the calculated difference in costs that you incur to operate your groundwater supply versus the cost that you pay on a unit cost basis to Cascade. That's the key difference there.
At some point, I'd like to see the detail of
Sure.
Of both the expense and the capital investments over the 20-year life cycle of all the options.
Yeah.
Councilmember Hunt, then Councilmember Winterstein.
A quick comment on the RCFCs. I think you mentioned just now that it was calculated 2 years ago. And I think if we're talking about 20 years, if they could redo that it may actually when we're talking about millions of dollars, be a different, it may look different with the current RCFCs that are being discussed with
Okay,
Cascade Water Alliance.
it could be, that's correct.
Councilmember Winterstein.
I agree with what Chris said a moment ago. Actually, in a way, another way to ask that is almost like I would like, as a policymaker, I would like to see like the pro formas for each of these options.
Okay. Any other questions on that before we move on?
Nope.
Okay. So, here's where we pull it all together. Again, a reminder of the need, and that is that regional supply will be needed sometime between 2021 and 2027 in the areas of the city currently using only groundwater. The recommended solution, as put forth in the water system plan currently, is to, one, maintain your current conservation program. That defers the need for blending by approximately 1 year. Convert Talus back to regional supply. That defers the need for blending by approximately 5 years. And then construct a centralized treatment and blending facility to implement option 1 on the supply options, which would introduce regional supply into the area currently fed by groundwater.
Councilmember Winterstein.
At the very beginning of this presentation, you did talk about converting Talus back to regional supply. Then you showed us that slide with a little footprint that covered part of the central area and said, you know, we can convert them to regional. Now we're back to talking about Talus. So I've lost the connection of points here. Could you, where did I lose you? I mean, I understand converting to regional, but when you showed us that footprint that covered part of the central area, you talked about maybe converting it to regional.
Right.
But you didn't say Talus, and that footprint didn't cover Talus. So where is that in this?
Well, I'm sorry. Well, we didn't talk about, I didn't cover Talus earlier because I didn't want to cover in too much detail ground that we had covered previously. And so, yeah, I mean, if we could go back to that, I can go back to the demand slide. I mentioned it, but very briefly. Well, right. This is where we're talking not about Talus, but about that other area. But before then, I just didn't speak to this in great detail, but on this slide?
No, I was talking about number 7.
Right. So you're correct. I mean, I did not raise Talus here because the point of this slide was to discuss this concept of, in addition to Talus or outside of Talus, is there some other area within the valley zone that could be carved out and converted to regional? Because Talus, infrastructure-wise, Talus is already set up to accommodate regional supply. To go beyond that, to carve out another area within the green, outside of Talus, requires additional infrastructure improvements. Does that speak to that? Okay.
Are there other questions? No? So can you go back to this slide 11 just for a second? So this recommended solution, is that one of those that you've got listed there?
So,
Paul's point, because it doesn't seem like it is.
what do you mean?
Slide 12, the recommended solution, doesn't seem like it's one of those options that's on slide 11.
Well, we didn't state it. I guess I should have said here, implement supply option 1, which is construct centralized treatment and blending facility to support blending and bringing regional supply into the groundwater fed area. That's option 1.
Okay.
Yes. But I understand, for clarity, I should have used that. We should have used those words there, option 1.
Sorry, so you're not, can you go back to slide 11 for a second? So, and why option 1 instead of option 3?
So option 1 is your lowest long-term cost. Yes, option 3, we're saying it's essentially the same, but you avoid the need in the complications of needing that additional infrastructure improvements. The cost is going to shake out to be about the same, but you avoid that those complications and those challenges associated with that.
So it's the same cost. Why does the administration recommend option 1 instead of option 3? What's the key factor, since cost is not the factor?
Well, that's what I'm speaking to. At the end of the day, both options result, not just in the same cost, but are going to result in blending of regional supply with groundwater supply.
Okay.
Associated with the costs in option 3 are significant additional infrastructure needs that, in addition to costs, are complicated and challenging, and option 1 avoids that, avoids the need to implement said improvements.
That's why, okay, so it's got the same net present value. This is why this conversation about having the pro forma of options 1 versus options 3 seems valuable, because I'm assuming you're saying, so it's deferring certain things, but the dollar values later are more, so the net present value, or?
So there's more upfront costs
One.
in piping, mainly in additional piping, to create some redundant piping, close loops to maintain fire flow availabilities. So there's additional upfront capital cost. Even though you're deferring the treatment plant capital, there's additional piping and valving costs upfront that offset that deferred treatment plant capital.
If I were to see the cost per year out towards 20, do they asymptotically approach different numbers? Or do they asymptotically approach the same number as for per year cost? In other words, you say there's certain things that are, certain investments that are occurring early on. That makes me think that then the costs later are lower if the net present value is the same between both options.
Well, again, I mean, the reason for that, you're deferring that big 24 million by between 3 and 6 years. So you get those savings in those discounted costs. So it's not that those real costs aren't less, but you're receiving some, you're deferring that.
Let me ask the question differently. So the 20-year net present cost is the same. How about the next 20 years? Are they different or the same?
They would be the same.
Would be the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Oh, good. Several questions. We're just going to go clockwise. So Councilmember Hunt.
Earlier, you said, I think, that you were going to talk also about risk, and I wonder if this option 3 also has, because you mentioned that it's more complicated, there's more need for infrastructure, so is there also, in addition to, this is the sort of average, but there's more variability in the cost associated with things coming up higher in cost than expected because you're building a lot more infrastructure, so there's more risk with that, or more variability with 3?
There's definitely more uncertainty with this option.
Okay.
In terms of the exact nature of the improvements that would be needed, the exact amount of deferral of the treatment plant investment. This is laden with a lot more assumptions and therefore uncertainty. So, yes.
Councilmember Ray.
I thought Councilmember Hunt's comment about risk was spot on, but it really does drive home. If we could, before we have to make a decision, could see the year-by-year layouts and what the expenditures and the discounting looks like, I think that would help us all wrap our brains around this.
Okay.
Next would be Deputy Council President Batiste.
So I would just agree with what Councilmember Ray and Hunt talked about, and that would help me look at that as well. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding, however, when I look at slide number 11, and we talk about number 1, and then on the next slide, 12, under the recommended solutions, there's 3 bullet points. Those are all incorporated into the recommended option 1 on the previous slide.
Yes, yes. Again, here we weren't talking about conservation, but it's an assumed it's happening, okay? Frankly, with all of these options, you're implementing conservation. It's just that this slide here is focused solely on costs associated with supply and treatment. And on the next slide, when we're bringing back in conservation, it's just a reminder of conservation is a part of that, this overall integrated strategy.
Thank you.
Your questions? None right now.
Okay. So, to speak to some of these questions and lack of clarity on option one being associated with this last bullet, for each of these three components of the recommended solution, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on each of them, again, as a reminder of what this means and what they entail for each component. So again, under conservation, you will recall the recommendation is to maintain Cascades' regional goal as the city's formal goal. And what that then means is to continue to implement your existing regional and local conservation programs. But we've also talked about implementing tracking of per household water usage trends relative to other informal targets, but not making those be formal goals. And then, of course, we recommend implement changes to your conservation program as warranted once Cascade updates the regional goal, which is slated to happen next year.
Councilmember Winterstein.
I recall the conservation conversation, and I remember thinking, and Vicki had said it to me as well afterwards, and it stuck in my mind, that the ambition with additional conservation beyond what was already kind of forecasted could be done, I thought that was extremely conservative. It wasn't very ambitious. I'm hoping, and I don't know if it's per household or something, some other technique, but this is more of just a general ask, but I think we could potentially do more with conservation than we looked at when we looked at that goal earlier. I know we've achieved quite a bit as a city, and I think you showed a chart that said, and we think maybe we can squeeze a little bit more out of this.
Right.
And that just seemed to be too conservative to me. So, and I don't know if that would change things, and I don't have specific recommendations, but what I do know is that when people who have water bills can directly associate their behaviors with costs and understand the benefits associated with those costs, they can make amazing changes. And I don't know that we've gone far enough with that yet.
Okay. All right. So that's the conservation piece. Then again, the second piece of this is water supply. And this is where we are recommending implementation of option one. It's the blended groundwater and regional. For these reasons, lowest long-term costs, you retain control of your local sources, you maintain supply reliability and distribution redundancy, and you minimize your water purchase costs. And then finally, with respect to water quality and treatment, the water system plan is recommending implementation of the centralized approach to a treatment and blending facility. This is because your existing sites are not expandable due to your site constraints. It's more efficient to operate one versus multiple facilities, and it's easier and less expensive to modify in the future one facility as opposed to multiple. So again, this is just a slide from the very beginning, pulling it all together and stating it in this form. These are the questions that are in front of council with respect to the water system plan. These are the recommendations laid out in the draft plan, and that ultimately we would be seeking council decision and action on. Now, a little bit about timeline and next steps. So this gets to the where are we in the overall process of things. So remember, the water system plan effort began last year, a little over a year ago, with the technical work and developing it. So here we are, summer of 2018, council work sessions. Recall that concurrent to this, there has been external review of the draft water system plan by the State Department of Health, King County, adjacent water purveyors, Cascade Water Alliance. All of those external reviews are completed and comments are in to staff. And so we are now at the stage where looking to do public outreach. We spoke a little bit about this the last time that we talked. You asked for public engagement and outreach on some of these topics. The plan is, and I'll have to defer to staff for more detail, but over the next couple months, to reach out to the public, primarily with a focus on the water supply options and associated costs, leading us ultimately to a finalization of the water system plan. To make that final then would require council adoption. And again, the plan right now would be for that to occur before the end of the year. But like I said, there is flexibility in that. There's no regulatory requirement that that has to happen by the end of the year. And then there are next steps. But before I go on, before that, are there questions on where we're at right now?
Councilmember, Deputy Council President Batiste.
Just a question on the public outreach. We have October, November. Are there a certain number of sessions of public outreach, or has any of that been defined? How much public outreach are we going to be able to do?
Sure. Well, we're looking for feedback at this meeting, and that helps us to decide sort of how much feedback or how many opportunities might be necessary. So I could probably better answer that question at the end. However, one opportunity we might have is if there are follow-up questions that need to be answered sooner rather than later for council members, such as pro forma information, we might look at October work session to provide that information back to you. We could probably schedule some community outreach around that same time so that that cost information is available to all of you and to the public so that you can get the feedback at that time. So we haven't decided methodology or a number of opportunities. We want to make sure that it's right-sized for the questions that we're going to pose and the feedback that you need.
Thank you. I could just, we can talk more about it, but I would like to see a few different opportunities come forward for the public to talk about this.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you. Your point about external agency review reminded me that we did have a representative from a nearby purveyor comment to us recently about the language in our plan regarding assumption. And I don't want to talk about, this isn't about his comments in particular, but I do recall the map. I know a lot of area within the city north of I-90 and around Eastgate, East Lake, Sammamish Parkway and east is not currently served. Does the treatment facility that you've envisioned here in this recommended option have the scalability to grow, not only if we were ever to go after assumption, but also just scalability in general?
For that question, I'm going to defer to my esteemed colleague who put together that conceptual plan for the facility. I think the short answer is yes, there's scalability in that. Would you agree, Pierre?
Yes, I'm Pierre Kwan with HDR. The scalability exists. We are making it modular such that in order to provide and accommodate future growth as it occurs, it will be scalable and modular such that when population growth demands, we can expand the facility as well as make it accountable for changing regulations and if we need new processes along the way. The main issue that it will be constrained is the water rights, the wells. We can only treat as much like, say, PFAS as what's currently coming out of the ground. There is right now no provisions in there to drill additional wells to meet that potential demand north of I-90.
Councilmember Ray.
So I'd like to see the public outreach also talk about conservation, just picking up on Councilmember Winterstein's comments about conservation, and really understand what our constituents think about our conservation goals and what we can do with them and what would be motivational.
Okay. Okay. We'll take all that into account. just a reminder in the formality of the steps on the water system plan, once council adopts the plan, then the state and the county would approve the plan. So that's just the formal sequence there. But as you'll see here then, the vision is that after the water system plan, which again is a plan, it's laying out a plan, it doesn't commit council to a particular improvement project, it lays out the plan. The sequence that would be envisioned then for advancing the plan in 2019 and 2020 would be the implementation of this integrated conservation, supply, and treatment plan. So the things that would be occurring in 2019, of course, on the conservation front, Cascade would be updating the regional water conservation plan. The treatment and blending facility would be undergoing planning phases. And this would be at the key point where the questions and the issues of fluoridation would be discussed in more detail about what level of treatment is desired, what are the options, the costs. Those details don't have to be grappled with within the context of the water system plan, but it would come later during the planning phase. And what we show here then, that would be followed by a rate study. Once those details are hashed out at a policy level, then look at a rate study for implications on rates. And then as demands are growing beyond 2021, as necessary, when needed, converting Talus back to regional supply, design and construction of the centralized treatment facility, and then bringing that online when needed. So that's kind of a high-level flyover of timeline. Other questions on that?
Councilmember Hunt.
I have a comment on, partly on public outreach and then also on fluoridation. In the memo, there was a question about council's preferences about fluoridation. To me, it makes sense to talk about it. All of the options will result, as you said, in integration of the regional water and blending at some point. And I think that the water chemistry, including a number of different things, is part of that discussion. And part of that water chemistry discussion is fluoridation. So to me, it makes sense to talk about it earlier than early 2020. And then also, we have received some input already, because I think that in some people's minds, this is something that could be discussed at this point when we're going through the water system plan. So we've received letters from the Pediatric Oral Health Research and Policy Center in support of fluoridation for the community benefits and prevention of cavities. And also, we have received a letter from a trustee for the Washington chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I think that as we go forward and talk more about our water system plan, we would probably receive more input from medical community and community health. So my personal preference, and I'm open to if anybody else on council has other thoughts, but I think that it's part of the natural course of the discussion to talk about fluoridation in the context of the water system plan.
So I will ask City Administrator Moon how, if we wanted to move that earlier as a public policy issue, either to speak to that or to be ready to speak to that next time, if not today.
Sure. Well, we teed up that question, and I'm happy to have feedback and love to hear from other council members if the desire is to spend time on that topic sooner rather than later. Later is shown in this slide. That's the absolute moment when we would need that policy decision. But we're happy to bring forth additional information and to try to stimulate some public engagement around that issue earlier. One opportunity is, again, with the engagement that we've talked about on supply options and costs, is to bring in fluoridation and provide additional material and pose the question to the public so that you can start getting that input. We probably need to talk a little bit more about how much information we would need to bring and how we're going to manage that conversation and where we would want to situate a decision on that policy question. As Jeff has spoken about, we need not take action on that at the same moment as the water system plan. We could take it earlier, we could take it later, and so we'll look to feedback from you to try to identify where it would occur on our planning calendar.
Councilmember Ray?
I think the fluoridation question is significant and super important. I think we are better served to separate these issues, and let's take care of the water system plan and set a direction and set our policy on that. And then quickly, hot on its heels, come back and deal with the second policy question, because I think the amount of debate and public comment around fluoridation could derail our water system plan, and we don't need to get derailed at this point. We can move this forward without that discussion. So my preference is to defer it until the future date that's not very future.
Councilmember Goodman?
I would agree with Councilmember Ray, maybe for a slightly different reason, although maybe it's just different words. I would think that the interest, the intense interest at a meeting where you're talking about both the plan and the fluoridation would be on fluoridation, because if don't know that you'd get a whole lot of interest in the plan if fluoridation was also a topic. It's already kind of dry enough, but I think that our community is so interested in its water resource, its drinking water, because we have groundwater, and it's been very special and important to our community, that I think people they do care about this, and I think if we have public outreach soon where people can get involved, I think they will, but if you throw fluoridation in the mix, then I think the focus would be on fluoridation and not on the plan, which is what we really want folks to focus on right now.
Councilmember Ramos?
And, yes, I agree, fluoridation is a controversial topic. Let me restate what I think you've said over time, so this might clear things up on that. Because previously, what I thought and heard was, obviously, regional water has fluoridation. So when I had heard that when it comes to ours, then fluoridation was almost a requirement, because once it had it, you had to keep that up. But now I heard you say tonight that regardless of that, once that blends, that could be a separate topic, because you're saying once it comes in, if we leave it alone, it just gets diluted, in which it's less so, or we could match it to have the standards that are normal, or we can actually take it out. So we'll have that ability with that central treatment plant that we could take it out totally. So the options in the future now are very much, we've got all our options open, so it's not something that we decide today that we're limiting our options. So we can add it, we can take it out, we can leave it diluted, and we have all those options. So I think if the public understands that, then if they understand that their discussion can wait. Otherwise, people think it's, they're waiting too long to make that decision. We don't want them to be stuck with that. That's why I'm trying to restate our options.
Yep.
Administrator Moon?
Sure, that's absolutely right, and that is why we have tried to separate them, because you aren't making that choice at this moment or with adoption of the plan. Having said that, though, I feel it's important to also point out that, of course, each option has different costs.
So I have a question, and then I know you still have a question. In fact, sorry, Deputy Council President Batiste.
Okay. I was just going to say, I can understand both perspectives on this, but I do think being able to point out that we would be talking about fluoridation later and having everyone be able to concentrate on the water system plan and ask the appropriate questions around that plan to start with makes the most sense to me. And then, we have fluoridation in 2019 or early 2020, having that maybe be sooner in 2019, so we could follow right up with public outreach and give everybody an opportunity to talk at that time seems to make good sense.
So remind me, where in the city is currently fluoridated?
So Any area that is receiving regional supply, I'm going to go to the map. Any area that's receiving regional supply is receiving water that has fluoride. So South Cove, Lake Mott, Montreux, the Highlands, and Grand Ridge. And then in addition, as pointed out earlier, Talus, which is on groundwater, but that water is fluoridated so as to maintain consistency with how it's been in the past.
Got it. So if we, because I'm inclined to say, let's not do it this fall, but let's not wait till 2020. If we said we were going to take it on in 2019, is there anybody who's currently fluoridated that would, in any scenario, if we wait, lose their fluoridation in this sort of interim time as we move, if we move forward with option one? Is there anybody that sees a diminishment of their fluoridation that currently has it? No? Okay. Because I'll tell you, I wish I had fluoridation. I'm of mostly English extraction, so I have bad teeth. And anything I can get to help with my teeth would be great. But unfortunately, I'm not in that area. All right, other, Councilmember Hunt.
I have one clarifying question. The current area that is not served, and when you drew that small area that could be separated, so for option 3, there would actually be a longer delay for people. That option does affect the timing of fluoridation versus option 1.
If we chose option 3.
If we were, which we have not discussed.
That's
but
correct. The fine point on that.
Options do affect the fluoridation status of a green hashed area, except for Talus.
Right. So again, the detail there, under option 3, this area, the blue, would see fluoride when that would be affected. But then the remainder of the green would see fluoride at a later date, or would receive that blended water once policy decision is made, fluoride or no fluoride, at a later date.
Councilmember Ramos?
Just the area getting fluoride, I think we missed an area. That stuff north of 90 Providence Point and that part of town also then looks like is getting.
Oh, the area served by Sammamish Plateau? Correct. You are correct. The area that's outside of your water service area, even though it's within the city limits.
In the city, but it's, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
That is correct. Yep.
And with that, we'll
Well,
ahead.
yes, so that brings us to the end. I think we've been discussing these 2 points. We simply wanted to come back around to what other information do you need and where do you want to go from here? But I would think we're hearing that. I think we've heard the things that you want to incorporate into the public outreach pieces over these next couple months. And you want to come back and discuss more on the fluoridation topic. So I think we have that.
So I'd like to ask Administrator Moon if maybe after tomorrow or whenever, if you could send out sort of a list of what you're expecting to come back to full council with, and then if there's any questions from anybody about if there's something they thought didn't get captured this evening, maybe we could circle back and make sure we've got everything.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Great. Anything else before we open it up to public comment? Nope. All right, thank you very much. Thank you for all 3 parts of this presentation. Really appreciate it. With that, I will ask if anybody, if members of the public would like to come forward and speak to us this evening and take a few minutes. 3 being a few? No, a couple is 2. A few is 3.
Skip Rowley, Rowley Properties, 1595 Northwest Gilman Boulevard. Looking at that map, it had that little blue footprint in the sea of green. I don't think that footprint is going to be involved in your option necessarily, but that encompassed quite a bit of our property. And there was a little blurb in this gentleman's statement here about fire flow being affected slightly. And fire flow is pretty important to us. We have spent millions and millions of dollars to ensure that we have adequate fire flow for future development. If there's somebody screwing around with our fire flow, we'd like to know about it. And that little blurb was more important to me than whether we fluoridated water or not. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to us this evening? Going once? Going twice? All right, thank you. We will then move on. And the final item that we have this evening is going to be ID 0294 Facility Space Study. And that's going to be presented by Administrator Moon, Parks and Recreation Director Watling, and Tom Beckwith, our consultant.
Council President Marks, would you entertain a 5-minute recess?
I will let us take a 5-minute recess, and I ask that everyone be back at 8:32. Thank you, Councilmember Ray. We are back, and we are going to proceed with IDO 294, Facilities Space Study. Director Watley.
All right, thank you. I will kick this off. This will be a bit of a tag team effort, but thank you very much. Good evening, Council. Tonight, we are here to really talk through some focus work that we did, and we had some approval, some budget approval this year to do, forgive me. We felt it's really a critical time in this study and this work to come back and report to you the work that we've done. The focus of this work was really looking at the 3 buildings that provide our City Hall services, and relatively unique as a city in that we utilize 3 facilities throughout town to provide our City Hall services. Those 3 buildings are this building, affectionately known as City Hall South. We have our City Hall Police Headquarters just across Sunset, and then City Hall Northwest on the other side of town. What we set out to do in this work was to evaluate the facility conditions, get an understanding of where we are now with those 3 buildings, and to as well begin to look at staffing needs and establish our current and our future space needs, our square footage needs, as it relates to staffing. In this work, we were also able to take a look at, and as we've ascertained the condition of those 3 buildings, begin to look at and identify short and long-term capital needs to address the facility life cycle, and also to look at how we might be able to address, if we can address, an ability to absorb staffing and agency growth. The first task of this effort was to certainly recognize we needed to bring in some expertise. We wanted to go out into the field and bring in some experts that could help us with this work. Rick Patterson and myself, Rick is our facilities manager, looked at our small works roster, identified architects on that roster, and invited those firms to submit SOQs, statements of qualifications. We interviewed 3 firms in March of this year. We selected the firm that you'll meet tonight of Tom Beckwith and ARC Architects. We were really impressed with all 3 of the firms we interviewed. We really felt what set Tom and ARC apart is they really focus on municipal governance. They focus on City Hall facilities. Done recent work in a number of municipalities around us, Redmond, Sammamish, Kirkland, Mukilteo, certainly, as well as some others. So felt well experienced to aid us in our effort.
Great, and I'm just going to cover the goals and intent of tonight's meeting. We are going to share the results and findings of the study. I'm going to give you the punchline right here, and that's that these aging facilities are nearing the point of significant capital investment, a couple more so than one, and that the current facilities weren't designed to perform as the city's primary location for customer service or governmental service delivery. One building was spec office space that we purchased. One was designed more to be police facility, and this building used to be a fire station. So tonight, our hope is to start a conversation, share some data, talk about a decision-making process that we might want to pursue, and to go down this path of making strategic choices about our facility planning. We have a proposed decision-making timeline for you we want some feedback on, and ultimately we want to gather questions and make sure that we're answering those questions for you and researching anything that you need more information on. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Beckwith, one of our consultants.
Tom, I will do a quick.
While we're waiting, I'll introduce the rest of my team. Rex, would you stand up? Rex is the architect for ARC. And we also had a full team of mechanical, structural, and electrical engineers doing assessment on those facilities. You're going to see some of the results of what they have done here. Advance with page up.
You can just scroll, just use this and you'll end up just scrolling down. Or you can.
See, we're already in trouble.
Sorry.
So how do I do that? There. This is the purpose, Emily outlined very quickly the purpose of the study. One was to take a look at your occupant growth. We call it occupant, not staff, because the occupants of your building includes. Oh.
Yeah, sorry, the folks up in the booth can't hear you.
Okay. Because occupants include not only full-time and part-time employees, they include interns and volunteers, and in some cases, consultants. So what we're really looking at is the combined growth of all those. We don't use years or don't prefer to use years because what generates your requirements are population levels. So we settled on 3. Your current is 37,000. Ideally, maybe within the next 10 years, you're looking at 41.5. And at the end of your current build-out period, you're looking at 45,000. So all of our projections and all the requirements that we worked up with the directors are aimed at those 3 targets. We're also looking at your optimal adjacencies. What we find lots of times, it's not necessarily the square footage, it's where things are located and how they interact with each other, and ultimately also how they interact with the public and your customers. We also looked at your existing facility conditions. We identified what we think you need to do within the next 5 years if you keep those facilities, and also what you would need to do if you decided to try to keep some of those facilities for 20 years. We determined if they could functionally accommodate the growth requirements we're coming up with and what your options were if they couldn't. We also determined what your minimum and long-range costs would be if you retain those facilities or if you decided to develop new. Show me how to scroll this. Can you reduce the size of the page? Maybe that'd be easier. These are the, excuse me, the projections for occupants. The red in the bottom is your 222 if we carried that forward. The blue is a combined additional that we developed with your directors about what it would be at those different or different population levels. Down on the bottom, I've itemized per each department the number of occupants. And I called out at least 3 departments that generate the most growth: development services, public works engineering, and police, including the jail. And I've said that those are proportional to the population, meaning that they're closer to what population generates in those departments, but it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio. The other departments also are affected by population growth, but not as dramatically and not as incrementally as those 3.
Can you, Councilmember Ramos?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Councilmember Hunt.
Go ahead. Right. Just looking at that, when you highlight those 3 departments, you scroll one down too far. Back at.
Can we go back?
Yeah. When you talk about basically FTEs.
Those are occupants, not FTEs.
Okay, occupants. Excuse me. And you talk about those 3 that create the most growth. And I'm looking at those numbers, and it looks to me like many others create a lot more growth than those. So police, going a little bit, but you have like executive, a number of those are doubling, 100% increase, and so forth. And just, where public works goes from 35 to 38, an increase of 3, and executive goes from 12 to 20. So I'm just trying to write how that works, because the numbers to the statements don't jive for me.
Oh, I highlighted the ones that create the most numbers, not necessarily that you won't have numbers in the other departments. Those are the 3 biggest. Now, certainly some of the other departments are going to grow, and comparison for what they are now versus what they're going to be in the future, like the executive, yeah, that's significant increase if you want. But when we add them up per department, they're not the 800-pound gorillas in the room. That's the only point I'm trying to make. And you'll see when we look at their square footage. Now, it is true, if you look at, we broke one other area out here. At the very top of the chart, we put what's called common areas. Those are areas that are shared by all the departments. So there's the public counters, the public lobby, the conferencing capabilities, the mail room, the loading docks, and so on. So we pull those out, and the activities that are in that particular group can be organized in different places within the building. They don't particularly belong to any department by itself. But if you look down that chart, the big numbers, if you want, are still in development services, public works engineering, and police. Now, later on, when we look at adjacencies and we're trying to configure where those departments should be, they're the ones that we will need to provide the most space to work around as we look at functional relationships.
So I'm sorry, I got to go back one slide to where Bill was talking about, because I too, I'm confused. I look at public works engineering and I only see that's an increase of 3, while, as he mentioned, 8 for city executive, and there's others, 7 for municipal court, and the numbers, there's a whole bunch there that show a doubling in size.
Public Works
Administrator Moon?
Yeah, so to restate Tom's point is he's just highlighted the groups that are the largest. He did not mean to talk about rate of change or percent of change, but just
Well, he said
total,
absolute growth.
The
Public
total,
works engineering is not.
I know, and I'm trying to help redefine the conversation. He's just saying these are the 3 biggest groups, and so when we look at space needs, we have to think about those in particular because they are ultimately the biggest groups. And then to answer your question about change over time, yes, some groups are showing greater percentage growth over time. Let's take city executive as an example. What you have in your head as executive group, redefine, because this also includes a bunch of other service units. So communications, the arts component, the neighborhood engagement, volunteers that may be associated with those programs. So our task as department directors was to first look at what is today's staffing level. That's represented by that first column on the left, the number associated with 30,000 population. And to look at not only our staffing level, but our volunteer, our limited term population right now, part-time, any bodies that we have that are helping us perform the work. And then think about in the future, what might that look like at 41,500 and then at 45,000. So those are all assumptions. And I don't want to get bogged down too much in those numbers or the assumptions behind them because they will change over time. I think you can feel confident because we've gone back over the left-hand column with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that those numbers are accurate for today's occupancy levels in those work groups. And I think Tom would tell you that even if we shave off occupancies in the middle column and the far right column, we still arrive at a place where the basic conclusions are true, that ultimately our current buildings don't meet future needs in a variety of ways. So hopefully that sort of helped.
It does. I have one second part, though. So public works engineering grows from 35 to 38, so that's a little under 10% growth.
Correct.
Right? But then if you go to square footage on the next slide, it grows by a lot more than that, right? It grows from 6,000 to 7,800 square feet, which is quite a bit more than 10%.
Let's back up a minute and I'll clarify. Every department in here has very detailed worksheets, spreadsheets. On the very first page of every worksheet is a list of every position within the department. And we forecast with them, the directors, about what they think they need at each of these population levels. And we went bottoms up and top down. Those were also reviewed by Emily and looked at reconciling between departments. When we looked at square footage, we had not only the space that the people live in, workstations and offices, we take a look at their equipment, their storage areas, their conferencing, their graphics, the IT capabilities and so on. And some of these departments grow proportionally more in square footage than just staff because they don't have those spaces and/or they're expecting those spaces to change over time. So it's not like you add one person, you proportionally add square footage just for that one person. What we're really looking at is what's going on in those departments, and then what kind of space do we need to meet their requirements.
Yes, so if I think about the conversation with PWE, as Tom mentioned, that was largely about need to house equipment.
Councilmember Hunt.
The Public Works Engineering, I noticed that one actually, the number of people at the middle population, 41.5 thousand, it went down, the number of occupants, but then the space did go up. And then the space goes up again when the population increases. So are they independent of the number of occupants? Or is that really just a function of the work plan?
Give me your question again, I'm sorry.
On Public Works Engineering,
Right.
I understand that there is more to it than just occupants, but Public Works Engineering is the occupants are projected to go down, and then
Yes.
the space is expected to go up. And so I'm wondering if they're in that case, not
In
related
Public
to
Works
each other.
Engineering are some consultants, 2 teams of consultants that work on projects. Right now, there's about 6 people involved in that. Their forecast for up to 41.5 is they won't have as many projects, they won't run as many consultants, they'll do more with staff. And then as they look at the 45,000, they're balancing their staff and what they consider consultants. And a decision by them about whether they house the consultant teams in-house or they use them outside of the building.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Would it be accurate? I'm going to make 2 statements. I'm wondering how accurate they are. Number 1, today's space utilization is not optimized. Number 2, your plan for the future is optimized.
That's the objective. Now, this chart also at the very bottom has 3 different numbers. Net square feet is what when we add up people and equipment. That's functional or usable square feet. Net is when we add in circulation. We got to get around those offices, get around the equipment, get around the workstations. And gross is to the outside of the building wall. So if you look down there, you can see, let's just take the 45,000 number, the total net is 73,000. But if we add to the gross, to the outside of the building, that includes stairwells, elevators, mechanicals, toilets, and so on, then we're looking at 84,000. Now, one of the issues when you go from a net to a gross is how functional is your building. If you're building a monumental building, that multiplier would be 25%, if it's a big public monument. If it's a functional building, we should be able to do that with 15% more, meaning the building was designed for your purposes. If it's an unfunctional building, you can easily chew up a lot of space just because the hallways and the corridors and so on just don't work for you. So we're presuming your gross should be a functional building.
I'll just say, we're talking about all the little individual items, but as I look at it, you're saying NSF goes up by about 20% as population goes up by about 20%, right? So
Probably.
when all is said and done, it's
Within reason.
proportionate.
Mm-hmm. And the only issue being how it's divvied up. One of the other issues is parking requirements. And what I put here is just an itemization of all the city vehicles plus some allowance for visitors. But really one of the bigger variables that affect you is how many of your staff or what % of staff you provide parking spaces for. If you're a suburban on the edge kind of city like you, where transit is not necessarily directly expanding outwards from you, then we put in an 80% factor. But that's really a policy decision. Bellevue is down below 50%, even pushing down into 40%, because they're on bus rapid transit, they're going to be on rail rapid transit, and they provide a lot of van sharing carpools where our employees tend to cluster where they live. So probably that 80% is more of a policy issue. One of the fascinating things is we asked each department where people lived. Very few people lived within the city or lived even within, say, clustered areas. So that's a policy decision, though. Nonetheless, you can see that you're looking at a
Sorry, I'm
substantial
sorry.
parking requirement.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Ramos.
I'm sorry, I have to comment on parking. We're pushing so hard on so many developments, and we're cutting down parking in so many parts of the city and reducing allowable parking, requiring less parking. And here, and I know there's more discussion to go, but, you know, to take basically a triple the parking amount for increase from, you know, basically triple it is, I know there's a lot of discussion to go, but that looks to me like something out of sync with the kinds of things we've been doing when we're looking at other developments we're allowing in the city. And I do think we need to walk our own, our own talk, and something I think would have a lot of discussion to come when we look at those things, because that's just, you know, it's tough for us to say everybody else has to do with less parking, and then we go full bore with it. And we're supposedly working on our transit systems and getting light rail, and all those things are coming, maybe not as quick as we like, but we also need to look at, say, we're supposed to be getting that too. So I just like to have a lot more conversation before we start tripling parking when we're adding, you know, a 50% increase maybe to workforce, but tripling parking. That just seems.
I think that's why we highlighted the percent that you decide to park of your staff. But if you look down through the other numbers, you still have city vehicles you store on site. And you got to expect that as your population increases, there are going to be more people coming to the city hall and coming to meetings and so on. But that's certainly a factor to keep in mind. As I said, Bellevue has pushed themselves down around the 40% mark. Seattle's even lower than that. One of the issues, or one of the workshop sessions also we've tried to do when we do these studies, determine adjacency relationships. And this is a result of having all department directors into a meeting, having each department director stand up and say where their spaces should be, which departments they should be next to, and how should the overall building be organized. The red areas are public areas. And you can see there's a long street or corridor through there that's intended to define the difference between public space and private space. So ideally, you would be coming in here, let's say those are the entry zones. These would be the primary public access points you're getting to, which would be the chamber, the court, or conference rooms. And then these areas in here would be secure. So the idea is the public can come to the counter, but the public no longer walks in through the building and through the different departments. And then even in some city halls, at night when these spaces are accessible, even barriers come down to zone off those areas. And unfortunately, that's kind of a sign of the times. Then the rest of the areas are color-coded. The blue areas are the purple areas where people live. That's state workstations and offices. Blue areas are special equipment and activity areas. And you can see there are some above the line up in here primarily because those are the spaces that support the court. And even though we try to zone the courtroom in the kind of secure area, you can see their activities still have to cluster around that, and that creates a double-tiered kind of secure environment. Then you can see numbers in there. And we asked the departments as we went through what's important, nice to have, critical. If there's a 3 assigned, it's a critical relationship that you would want to design the building or wherever you locate those departments so they're next to those functions. 2 is important, 1 is nice to have. If there's no number, and then it's just serendipity. And if we were to design or look at how your buildings are used or in the future, we would take this diagram and then start making those spaces actual square footage and then see just how they fit. So what we do is we work from the optimum. This is the optimum allocation based on what the department directors say they have with each other and with the public. Now, the only other thing on here is your existing facilities, and you can see down at the bottom, we've added up your 3 buildings, not including the jail, because we're not projecting the jail. So you have 57,000 square feet of gross building area and 121 parking spaces that are off-site, not including what's on your streets that's used for parking. So then we analyzed your buildings. We took the teams through and analyzed every feature within the buildings. This is City Hall South. The only issue, as Emily pointed out, it is a fire station, been converted a number of times, but the configuration of the building is still a fire station. You're working around the way it was structurally designed, the way it was structurally laid out. This is a list of the functional deficiencies and the infrastructure deficiencies, but the implications are still that we can fix things for a cost. All the things in the left-hand columns just cost money. We can take care of them. But really, the building's an undersized footprint and has an awkward layout, and it's difficult to make it work as a court, as an IT function upstairs, and even as a Chamber of Commerce. There are limitations to what we can do, and this building is pretty well fixed on its property. It's not easy to expand it. We did the same thing with City Hall Northwest. The only thing I would point out is this is a spec building. It was designed for multi-tenants, and for that reason, it has a central core as you come in, and then splits off with the idea there would be multiple tenants in each of those wings. When you occupy the building as a single tenant, it's a very inefficient, insecure building in which to try to reorganize. So you're always going to have public in this zones, and then whatever you do in these wings, your employees, if they're split up between those wings, are going to be walking in and out of the public secure zone in which to work. Or if you're bringing the public in, it is a challenge to try to zone off which areas of those buildings to be secure in. The bigger issue, though, is our analysis of its functional deficiencies and infrastructure deficiencies. As a spec building, it was designed to be 20 years life cycle. At the end of that life cycle, it's not the physical life cycle, it's the economic life cycle where a developer would expect to reinvest, sometimes even tearing those buildings down and starting over, recovering costs on a new facility. The key issue we have, again, not just money, but it is an awkward layout that we cannot necessarily fix. It's still a multi-tenant, two-winged, publicly difficult building on which to reorganize.
Can I ask a question about seismic shear walls if improvements exceed 50% of value? What does that mean?
When you have to expend more than 50% of the building's value in which to fix it, then you have to comply with all current codes. This building was built 20 years ago, so there's some issues on ADA access. There's some issues on how your public spaces are organized. If the money you spend in this building to retrofit it to get another 20 years exceeds 50% of its current value, then everything is all current code.
So that's telling me that it doesn't currently have seismic shear walls.
No, it's got some seismic issues. Did you want to comment on that at all real quickly?
Can you come to the microphone, please?
This is Bond, Rex Bond.
Rex Bond.
Yeah, that's me. So there is already a little bit of shear in the building, plywood shear walls, but it doesn't meet, it's fine for today because we're not doing anything to it, but it does not meet the current standards that we would be imposed upon if we went to 50% of the value of the building. I think more importantly is there's a lot of ADA. None of the bathroom facilities are ADA accessible in that building. And you're bringing the public in, not only your staff, but you're providing a public service there that is currently not being met. So there's just some inherent issues with a building of that age. I'm not saying it's a bad building, it's just a building of that age that needs to be brought up.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions right now? Okay.
Thanks, Rex. This is City Hall and Police. There are some minor functional deficiencies in the building to correct, not major, that aren't as significant as the other two buildings. But the key issue here is this is a very custom designed building. It was designed to be a police building per se. And so it's not a building that's easily reconfigured for some other activities, mainly because of security problems and access between the two floors. There are some big space issues in that building, even for police. There are not enough locker facilities, training facilities, or evidence storage areas. And in order to provide those kinds of spaces, we have to use or cannibalize space on the first floor, and that starts pushing things upstairs in order to meet requirements long term. So we did some costs. I think can't walk away from this. The bottom line here is we estimated 5-year immediate cost for each of those buildings. You can see the cost per square foot varies around $50. Then we looked at the 20-year cost for all the things we itemized that needed to be done if you were to keep them that long, and what the cost would occur for there. And you're almost up to $241 per square foot as an average. By comparison, a brand-new building is usually priced at about $500 per square foot. So you're spending half of the value of what it would take to build new to make those usable for 20 years. The biggest costs are in Northwest, and in some respects in City Hall Police because of the expansion requirements to do that. Then we looked at what would it take to, including those renovation costs, to expand the facilities to meet your requirements without taking into account where that would be. We just took the expansion requirement and estimated it as new space wherever it happened to be, and they did the same thing with parking. And, sorry, I got to read this a little bit here. You can see in the yellow codes where I've tried to show you what the totals would be. So to expand the facilities between $37,000 and $45,000, you'd be spending between $22 million to $30 million. Let me get this on a page where I can read it. And if you were at the time value of commuting, because that was one of the issues, people are driving between these 3 facilities to meet and have conferences, particularly because Northwest has more conference space than the other 2 facilities. So we calculated what that cost would be over those 3 time periods, and by the time you got to $45,000, you would have spent about $1.6 million just in time travel cost. And then we added all those costs together, and they're down at the very bottom: renovate, expand, commute, and park. We also add parking into that. Essentially, to meet current needs, you would be investing about $26 million. That's the 5-year interim requirements. But by build out at $45,000, you would be investing about $38 million to renovate, to expand, commuting costs, not accounting for wherever you would expand. Then we looked at what the new cost of developing brand new.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Ray?
Just a quick question on parking. Is that surface parking, or is that, say,
Deck.
parking garage?
We just assumed it was a deck.
Okay, so I don't think we can do that. Don't we have a structured parking requirement here?
I don't know if government facilities.
Maybe it goes to
provide
the
structured parking.
Councilmember Ramos says we got to walk the talk.
Well, the only reason we estimated it would be decked, parking decks, because your land values are going to get to the point by comparison. If you're building a surface stall, usually that's about $6,000 to $7,000 just to develop it. If you're building a parking deck stall, I think we priced that at $30,000 per square foot.
Okay.
But
So
if
it is
you
structured.
begin to add in the land and whether you get the land available, then you want to run the test between the 2. And
So
just to
good news, we
be
would be walking the walk.
We would be walking the walk.
When you say decks, you're referring to structured parking?
decked, yes, structured parking, not underground, above ground,
Okay.
stacked.
But not surface parking, that's the real question.
Correct.
Great, thank you.
Now, it would be the same if you assumed either way, but our assumption, at least at this point, is it would probably be decked because you're going to have a challenge finding the land for this. Now, the next cost is we presumed you would, what if you developed a new city hall for comparison? This assumes you would keep your city hall police, but you would phase this building out and Northwest building out and build a new facility to pick up whatever the balance would be, wherever that happened to be. And it also assumed that you would be reducing the commuting costs, presumably. You could be all in one facility or one place, and also presumed that you could sell this building and the Northwest building and factored that into cost reduction. And look at down at the bottom, to get through the initial period, even you'd be renovating still police and city hall, you'd be $27 million. By the time you got to the $45,000 build out, you would be $36 million. So we compared those on the next graphic. Red is keep your existing facilities. You can see that's cheaper at $37,000, cheaper at $41,500, but more expensive by the time you get to $45,000. That's just if we ran a 20-year scenario. Now keep in mind, if you keep your existing buildings, you've taken some buildings that are already 20 years old and you're pushing them into 40, so you could expect to have some major cost at the end of this cycle. If you build new, you're probably looking at a 40 to 50-year building. Your life cycle costs from that point on would be less, but we didn't analyze beyond just the 20 years. The last thing that we like to point out, we call keeping the eye on the ball, and that's the cost of facilities versus staff. And in this particular example, what we did is we just presumed we would have one staff person, and arbitrarily we said that their annual salary and all benefits would be about $60,000. Then we calculated what it would cost to build the space just that they would occupy, just for that workstation, and to maintain it and to operate it over 20 years. In simple terms, staff in the first year is 94% of all the costs if you're amortizing the building and parking and everything at over 20 years. But at the end of 20 years, staff is almost 97% of the cost. The building is about 3.3% of the cost. The furniture is about 0.7% of the cost. Or put it another way, if you could make your staff 3.3% more efficient by housing them in an effective building, you can pay for the building just with staff productivity. Any questions on, this is a summation of a lot of detail. I appreciate that. We're trying to give you the big picture.
I don't have a question about this slide, but I do have a question about the building that we haven't talked about is Public Works operations and our Emergency Management Center. How does that factor into everything? Administrator Moon.
Well, we did not include that as you stated in this. I'm going to guess, you may know that we have a master plan for that facility and expanding it. It is not as old a facility. It is not is in need of major reinvestment at this point in time, and it has some additional capacity. I think we will be nearing a point where we need to have that conversation, particularly if we continue talking about possible relocation of parks maintenance and facilities maintenance staff, relocating them from the Confluence area, then we will need to find a home for them. But there may be several options for that, and that building just wasn't included in this. We looked really at more of the general governmental services.
Okay.
No, we did talk to IT. They're scattered in multiple facilities, and they do run your emergency management out of Public Works, and they thought the bulk of their operations should still be in City Hall.
Councilmember Ramos?
And I had the same question, but extended it to our other very large department and expensive one is Parks and Rec. And I know we have field operation and that there's a difference in field operations, but there's a lot of bodies that you deal with as well. And we're missing those two pieces as far as, location of bodies and so forth. And I know we've got some talk about, Parks and Rec, losing some facilities and where we got youth scattered all over the place. And we're talking about scattered and getting things more efficient, yet we're leaving this piece all at this point scattered and not part of the conversation.
Sure. So Parks and Rec administration, sort of our general office and oversight folks, have been included in this. So they were on those initial tables, thought being we may have opportunities to also bring them in-house and gain those efficiencies. But the other staff, the staff that works at Community Center, we assume still works at Community Center. Maybe at some point in time, those facilities need to be enlarged or enhanced in some way to accommodate growth in that kind of staff. And then again, outdoor,
Right.
facilities and parks maintenance folks were not included here.
Thank you. Other questions right now? You have more material to present?
That's it, I think.
I'll switch over and we'll.
Okay, so the last piece that we wanted to do was to walk through a potential timeline for continuing this conversation. And so on this slide, we're showing the work session. There are a few factors shown on this table that we want to call attention to. One is budget development for 2019. Another significant factor is the development of the next 5-year capital improvement plan. So in fourth quarter 2018, we are going to pursue some enhancements to City Hall Northwest. We're trying to be very cognizant of return on investment on those improvements, but we do have some security needs that we need to address, and some potential access solutions, those lower cost items that we believe we can achieve. And the budget that you established for this project included both the study and consultant work plus a little bit of capital work. And so that's the increment that we are going to anticipate using toward the end of this year. We are also shaping up a 2019 budget request for additional reconfigurations and minor improvements that we could take on next year in order to enhance our efficient use of space. So for example, get storage out of the buildings, reconfigure for some office space. We have some opportunities in City Hall Northwest with some leases coming to an end that may allow us to locate staff in a more efficient manner. So you will see that in the proposed budget, and we'll walk you through that at that time. Then in early 2019, we would propose to come back to you with some pros and cons that dive in deeper on long-term options for investment, and in particular on these 3 main facilities. Conduct public outreach and engagement, talk about those options, and then simultaneously we would be in development on the next capital improvement plan. Later in 2019, we'd have a work session to walk through perhaps the preferred long-term option. At that point, we would have better detail on funding options and strategies, depending on which plan we're going for. Different options are available. Again, conduct additional public outreach and engagement. And then in late 2019, we would have council deliberations on those options, and we would also be wrapping up the city facility inventory assessment. We'll talk about that in a second. I'll come back to that. So it would dovetail with this work, and you would be adopting the next 5-year capital improvement plan, and we would incorporate that next year 1 into the 2020 budget. So on the city facility inventory assessment, we have a desire to look at all the properties that we own and make sure that we have characterized those well, and we want to make sure that we have synced up an inventory with our asset management schedule, and that we are examining uses of those facilities, opportunities for disposition of them. We're going to be coming to you with that data and talking through some policy considerations, and hopefully have a more consistent way in which we operate the various properties that the city owns. So that's the timeline. Happy to answer any questions on that. And then really, at this point, we just wanted to turn it back over to you for any questions, discussion, any input that you can give us on what information you would like for next steps.
Councilmember Goodman.
I just had a quick question. The net cost of developing new city hall / parking, does that include land cost as well?
No, it does not.
Answer was no.
And that's the same on a dispatcher of existing facility.
So,
So it would seem to me that the net cost of developing should include land. Doesn't that change numbers?
It should, but I think the question there is where you would put it, what your long-range strategy is for that.
So just to simplify, we didn't make an assumption. We have some options that run the gamut, and so we just left that factor out of these calculations.
Including maybe using existing land or something?
Correct.
okay, so that's hard, okay. That makes it hard to look at one number that's at 38, another number that's at 36, and say, oh, at that point, it's going to be $2 million to our advantage to do something new.
Right. We just wanted to keep baseline consistent. There are lots of different variations of those costs. I'm happy to play those out, but I think we would love to have a conversation with you about the options available to us. We believe we have some strong contender options for available land that the city owns.
Okay, but to compare apples to apples,
sure,
we should probably carry some straw man number, right? Because whatever, if it costs $38 million to renovate existing land, and it costs $36 million plus whatever additional land it would take to do something new, and that 36 includes selling 2 of the 3 parcels, and the third parcel stays with the IPD, then clearly you've got to use land someplace else, and that's an opportunity cost, right, of some number. And we wouldn't have to talk about a specific parcel, but if you just said land in Issaquah costs this much, and, with an FAR, with a target FAR, you might say a reasonable sized piece of land would be X, and that's got a straw man value of Y, then you're going to see it's going to, if you compare apples to apples, then that 36 versus 38 really potentially changes quite a bit. Does it not?
We'd be happy to include that. Sure.
I think that would be comparing apples to apples, is to have some, and you can decouple it from specific pieces by just having a sort of a pro forma value of what a piece of land would be with an FAR that seemed reasonable.
Okay.
Other questions? Councilmember Goodman?
Can you go back to your slide before we were talking about? So, okay, well, it's getting late, but so I would think that next time we meet, we could, it would be a good time to talk about what those options are. We do own a fair amount of land, right behind us, for example.
Yeah.
And so, but it probably would be a good, the next time we meet on this topic, to talk about what those options are.
Okay.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Tom, I have a question for you. You called it eye on the ball slide. I think that's what you called it. I'm sorry, but I didn't get your main point there. I've looked at it, but I couldn't. Could you go over that for me quickly?
Usually, when you're looking at these kinds of questions, what you're looking at is building costs. You're looking at the total cost that you're going to invest in a building and land and everything else. But really, the whole point is you're housing staff. And the issue is, whatever you're putting in them, is it the most efficient solution? Is the most productive solution? So when we ran that scenario, we're trying to say, look, if you just took the employee and just built the space underneath them, over first year and 20 year, where's the money really going? It's to pay for that staff person, not in the building per se, even though right now you're faced with a price tag for a building. So keeping your eye on the ball says the building is creating the work environment for efficient staff person. So compare your building cost and what impact it has on that staff person's efficiency. And when you look at it that way, the building is a negligible part of that investment.
We just don't have a measure of the impact to efficiency.
True, but one of the issues we were looking at was just commuting costs. And we just said, what does it cost for people to drive back and forth between 3 buildings just to meet? We're not looking at the examples about, well, why do you have to schedule meetings in those different places? We also didn't look at issues about what happens to customers. How many different buildings do they have to go to try to do the function that you do? Some of the things that are over at Northwest is because you don't have room in this building or City Hall. And some of the issues in City Hall and even in this building is because there's not enough building to provide the kind of space that you need to do the job. And we did not measure the efficiency of that. We used kind of this comparison, this abstract comparison of a staff person versus the building. But it's the most important variable to consider.
All right, thank you for that.
Councilmember Hunt.
I had a similar question to Councilmember Winterstein, which is about this assumption that we will have a lot greater efficiency. And I wondered if there's some way to provide some information, so commuting time, but maybe also the other reasons the departments would want to, or perceived efficiency, because that's, I think, one of the driving factors, and it's really not clear to me how that would work or what the magnitude of that benefit would be based on this information.
You mean, excuse me, how to measure efficiency?
Well, I imagine it's very difficult, but I'm wondering if for future conversations we can have information about how efficiency would be
Would it be
affected
improved by a
these
consolidated
changes.
building, for example?
Yes.
When we've done some city halls, in an attempt to measure that, we've done surveys of customers that come in, ask them how many different places they go, building-wise, just to get whatever they're going to do, from permits to meetings to license fees to so on. We've also measured the employees, how many different places you have to go, as we did in the commuting cost. We've also taken a look at what kinds of spaces are where. For example, your prosecutor's next door, not here. You don't have defense attorney spaces here. You don't have defendant holding spaces here. You don't have evidence storage spaces, for example, in your police department. And there it gets a little bit more difficult, because then you're going to sit down with that staff person and say, well, what do you do to compensate for the fact you don't have evidence storage? Well, you're making more trips, you're moving evidence somewhere else, you're moving it somewhere here, or you're just not doing the job. So when you really, really dig into that, that's an important but a very comprehensive attempt to try to come up with what your efficiencies are now versus what it would be in a new building. Generally, we've found that where the buildings are consolidated, they're performance-based, they follow the adjacency factors, they have the kinds of spaces it takes to support the activities they're trying to do. Staff and the department directors report they're much more efficient, they're much more energized, they're much more productive, and probably in today's age, they're much better at attracting high caliber talent. And there is, I have to point that out, and in some comparisons of other facilities we looked at, you're going to be recruiting in a scarce labor market the next couple of years as your people retire. And if you go and visit Bellevue or Kirkland or Redmond or your facilities, you have to look at the impact that has on your future workforce and whether they want to work for you. And it's a demanding workforce. They want to live they want to work in an environment that they expect is highly productive. And it's difficult to put a person in a space that doesn't look that way and expect them to have the same attraction and energy. That's a long-winded answer. Did I help?
That did help. Thank you.
Deputy Council President Batiste.
So just on that same point right there, when you are looking at the time value of commuting between meetings, is that just the commute time? Meaning
Yes.
You get in your car and you go, but it doesn't take into account what it means to get ready to, I have to go to another building or collaboration, that may or may not happen.
Only the commute time and only the amount of minutes it takes to go from one place to another and back, and what the value per person's salary benefits are to do that.
Okay.
Probably, if you were to really evaluate it, the frustration of having to do that is probably greater an impact than the actual drive time back and forth.
Thank you.
Councilmember Goodman.
So the policy question for us is, given current conditions, how do we want to proceed with City Hall facilities to best serve the community into the future? So I'd like to make some comments on that. First of all, the space planning, or the space problems that we have they've long been a problem. It's been a problem for a long time. We have for 20-plus years planned to have a municipal campus, it was called, and it was in this area between this building and the community center. And so I am totally supportive of the idea that we go into first quarter of 2019 and go through the work session pros and cons and the public outreach and engagement, because I think it's important. I think this is an important project that needs to get done, but I want to know how the public feels about this, because what I've said for the last couple of years when this comes up just as a topic, we need a new city hall, is I don't think the public views, I would be surprised if the public elevates this to higher than other capital needs in our community. Transportation comes to mind. So that's why I'm in favor of moving at least through the first quarter of 2019 and get through another step in this process. So I wanted this, like I said, I would like this to be done, but I'm concerned about the perception of the public that we would be using a lot of money that they might think we could use in other ways. I want to particularly, Tom, thank you for what I thought was an outstanding presentation. I have never seen a study like this before, because I've never been in a position where I've needed to see a study like this before. But and it's all new to me, but I was fascinated by the study, and I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you. Besides considering whether or not to build new and where the site should be or not, you should also look at the delivery methods. They have a big difference on how you finance things and what the public approval requirements would be or not, what your financing costs would be, and that would be for later phases.
Deputy Council President Batiste.
So I had a question regarding ADA compliance and the timeline that is associated with the buildings that we currently have not being ADA compliant.
I think our hope is to at least make some improvements in that direction in 2019.
Okay.
Your issue is not just to make them compliant, but the minute you make them compliant, you're going to end up with less restroom facilities, and you're already undersized in every one of those buildings. So that's another issue to contend with if you decide to keep some of them.
So that change impacts, for example, the number of restrooms that are available.
Even without considering ADA, you're under toileted for the number of occupants you have in all of these buildings.
Okay. Come back.
Other comments? I'll mention, yeah, that ADA compliance thing seems like something that, again, if we're going to be comparing apples to apples, if we're talking about in a new facility, we would just get everything ADA compliant. The costs, the 20-year costs of the existing facilities, somehow we have to quantify that in, and I'm not sure it's quantified in currently. Is it in that $38 million? Does that assume?
For the 5-year, it definitely assumes meeting ADA requirements in your public zones.
Okay.
The bigger issues between the 5 and the 20 years, whether you begin to expand the facilities you need, considering that some of those spaces are going to have public toilets versus staff toilets, particularly as you get into the security zones.
So one way or the other, our apples to apples comparison, if it's at 20 years out, we should have ADA compliant facilities for both visitors and staff.
Yes.
Right? And our cost model should incorporate that. The other question that I have is on transportation. And, you know, I don't know how, I don't know if we drag Torsten in, but understanding in one block, right, we have a East Side Fire facility, we have the IPD, we have City Hall staff, we have City Hall visitors, we have IPD visitors, we have court, you know, council meetings,
Yes.
all in the space of a block,
Yes.
right? And what that would mean if we did something different. And, you know, to Councilmember Goodman's point about priorities in the community, if in fact that would have an impact on traffic downtown, I think it'd be important to understand that.
Okay.
going forward.
Thank you. Understood. As you were talking, I thought it might also be helpful to let all of you know that we are in the midst of doing a parking study. Part of that parking study includes an examination of available parking right in this vicinity as it relates to really the bus stops. But we are intending to survey our staff and get a better handle on who is parking and where. And we do understand that we're a driver of parking need here, and that we can take opportunities to diminish that need. But there are a lot of functions here in the center of town that are community service type functions, and people are coming and going to access those services, and many of them continue to need or want parking.
I would add one more caveat to your apples to apples. We estimated development and renovation costs. We did not estimate operating costs. Operating costs in a brand-new, smart, green building are going to be substantially lower than your existing facilities over 20 years. We just didn't go there for this particular analysis.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Deputy Council President Batiste.
So I just wanted to echo that this presentation and all the information is fantastic to just be able to look at and be able to do those comparisons and think through some of those particular issues. I am concerned about both what we talk about in terms of the ADA compliance and also security. And just looking at a lot of the numbers. So I'm supportive of what we're doing going forward. And as Councilmember Goodman pointed out in Q1-19, being able to understand those pros and cons and maybe some of the questions that we've asked here, bring back more information, and then be able to do some public outreach around this with numbers and reasoning and that kind of thing, I think is great.
Other comments, questions, things you want to see the next time we talk about this, and you want to see it? No. All right. Do we have any public comment? Anybody? No? Hour is late. We do not. Administrator Moon, is there anything else?
No, thank you.
All right. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.